They appear in cave paintings 12,000 years old. They're described in the earliest Sumerian texts. They've been seen by military pilots, shot at by fighter jets, and have taken millions of people against their will. They are the tall grays, the most documented non-human intelligence in human history. Their eyes are vast and black. Their heads are enormous. They don't speak. They communicate directly with your mind. And according to military whistleblowers, government insiders, and Harvard psychiatrists, they've been here for a very long time. The question is not whether they exist. The question is, what do they want, and why have they been hidden from us for 80 years? This is the complete documentary, everything known about the tall grays. They have been described in the cave paintings of ancient Namibia, scratched into the cliff faces of the American Southwest, and whispered about in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years. They appear in the earliest written records of Sumerian civilization, loom in the margins of Egyptian mythology, and surface again and again in the testimonies of modern men and women who share a haunted look in their eyes, and a story that defies any conventional explanation. They are tall, they are thin, they are the color of ash or pale gray. Their heads are disproportionately large, their eyes vast and obsidian black, their faces stripped of the features we associate with emotion. They do not speak with their mouths, they do not seem to need air in the way we do, and they have been visiting this planet, or have been here, for a very long time. This is not a program about little green men. This is not a program rooted in comic books or Hollywood fantasy. What you are about to hear comes from military officers who served their nations with distinction, from aerospace engineers who spent their careers at the most classified facilities in the world, from medical professionals, school teachers, farmers, and airline pilots, people with everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain by stepping forward. It comes from government documents pried loose through decades of freedom of information requests, from classified briefings whose contents have leaked piece by piece into the public record, and from a handful of insiders who waited until the last years of their lives to unburden themselves of what they had seen and what they knew. We are talking about a specific class of non-human intelligence that the research community has, for decades, referred to as the tall grays. Not to be confused with the short, childlike beings more commonly associated with abduction accounts, though those entities are part of this story too. The tall grays represent something altogether different. They are described consistently as standing between 6 and 8 feet in height. Their limbs are elongated, their fingers long and tapered. Their skin carries that distinctive gray or blue-gray pigmentation. Their skulls are enormous, cranially expanded to a degree that suggests a brain, or whatever analog serves that function, of extraordinary size. And their eyes, those vast unblinking eyes that witnesses return to again and again in their accounts, seem to contain not just intelligence, but something older and more unsettling: recognition. Recognition of us, recognition of our history, perhaps even recognition of what we are destined to become or what they intend us to become. Over the course of the next hour, we are going to pull apart everything that is known, suspected, and theorized about this specific group of beings. We are going to examine where they come from, the stellar origins that researchers have pieced together from decades of contactee testimonies, and increasingly, from the emerging science of exoplanetary research. We are going to look at the historical record, from the deepest corridors of human prehistory to the corridors of the Pentagon. We are going to examine their agenda, what they want from us, what they have taken from us, and what, if the darkest theories are correct, they intend to do with what they have collected. We are going to explore the mysteries that even the most dedicated researchers cannot resolve, the gaps in the timeline, the contradictions between different witness accounts, and the profound philosophical questions raised by the very existence of beings who appear to regard humanity with the cool, assessing gaze of a scientist studying a specimen. This is the story of the tall grays. Strap in. Naming the shadow, classification, and description. Before we can talk about where they come from or what they want, we need to talk about what they are. And this is, immediately, where the story becomes complicated. because the term gray alien is a category, not a species. Within the broader taxonomy that UFO researchers, government insiders, and contact experiencers have developed over decades, gray refers to a range of beings that share certain physical characteristics, but may represent radically different civilizations, different agendas, and different relationships to humanity. Understanding the distinction between these subgroups is essential to understanding what makes the tall grays unique and, in many respects, the most consequential of all the entities in this taxonomy. The short grays, sometimes called the Zeta reticulans, the Zetas, or simply the small grays, are the beings most commonly described in classic abduction accounts. They stand somewhere between 3.5 and 5 feet tall. Their heads are large, but not the towering cranial structure of their taller counterparts. Their eyes, while enormous and dark, are slightly less pronounced. Their behavior in abduction scenarios tends to be procedural, almost mechanical. They perform tasks, they collect samples, they seem to be following protocols established by someone or something else. Many researchers have compared their behavior to that of worker insects or to highly specialized technicians, rather than the behavior of beings acting with independent volition and authority. The tall grays are something else entirely. When they appear in close encounter accounts, they are never performing the procedural tasks. They are observing, they are communicating, they are making decisions. Witnesses who have encountered both types in the same scenario, and there are many such witnesses, consistently describe the tall grays as being in command. The short grays defer to them. They step back when a tall gray enters the room. They wait. The tall gray approaches the human subject, and what follows is almost always some form of direct communication, not through sound waves moving through air, but through a process that witnesses can only describe as the thoughts simply arriving in their minds, fully formed, complete, carrying not just information, but emotional tone. Retired Army Sergeant Clifford Stone, who served as part of a specialized retrieval unit tasked with recovering downed craft and biological entities, described his encounters with tall grays in congressional testimony and in subsequent interviews in stark terms. "When one of them looked at you," he said, "it wasn't like being looked at by a person. It was like being read, like everything you were, your history, your fears, your potential, was being cataloged in a matter of seconds." Stone claimed to have encountered 57 different species over the course of his career, and he maintained that the tall grays occupied a position of authority among those species that was unmistakable. The physical description of the tall grays, as compiled from hundreds of independent witness accounts spanning 6 continents, is remarkably consistent. The height range places them between 6 feet and 8 feet tall, though some accounts push as high as 9 feet. The body is slender to the point of appearing almost fragile, with a chest cavity that seems too narrow to accommodate human-style lungs, and a midsection so attenuated that witnesses frequently wonder how such a creature remains upright. The arms are long, hanging well below where human arms would end, and the hands terminate in 3, 4, or occasionally 5 digits that are tapered and flexible in a way that suggests extraordinary manual precision. There are no visible nails. There is no visible musculature in the conventional sense. The skin simply curves over what must be some underlying structure, but it moves in ways that don't map neatly onto what we understand about skeletal muscular systems. The skin color varies within a band of cool, desaturated tones. Most witnesses describe it as gray, but there are consistent reports of blue-gray, pale white gray, and occasionally a quality described as almost translucent, as if, under certain lighting conditions, you could almost see the outline of whatever lies beneath. The skin does not appear to sweat. It does not appear to breathe in any visible way. It does not seem to respond to temperature the way human skin does. In cases where witnesses report physical contact, and this is uncommon but not unheard of, the texture is described as smooth and cool, neither soft nor hard, but intermediate in a way that has no obvious human analog. The head is where the tall gray form diverges most dramatically from anything in terrestrial biology. The cranium is vastly expanded relative to the face, which is small, delicate, and positioned at the very front and bottom of this enormous structure. The forehead extends back and upward in a curve that has no precedent in hominid evolution. The skull's sheer volume implies a brain capacity, if brain function is indeed what that space serves, that dwarfs human cognitive architecture. The face itself is spare, 2 small nostrils set flat against the face, a mouth that is thin and rarely open, ears that are so vestigial as to be nearly invisible, and then those eyes. The eyes of the tall gray are the single most reported and most remembered feature of every encounter. They are vast, almond-shaped, and wrapped around the face so that they seem to take in a much wider visual field than human eyes. They are uniformly dark, ranging from very dark gray to absolute black, with no visible distinction between iris, pupil, and sclera. They do not blink, or if they do, witnesses rarely catch the moment. They do not move in the rapid, scanning way that human eyes move. They seem to simply fix on their object of attention with an intensity that witnesses consistently describe as overwhelming. Not threatening necessarily, but overwhelming, as if being perceived that completely was itself a kind of revelation. Some researchers have proposed that what we see in the eyes of these beings is not the eye itself, but a kind of protective overlay, a covering that shields a more sensitive optical structure beneath. This would explain the uniformly dark appearance and the absence of a visible pupil. Others have suggested that the eyes are adapted for conditions of much lower light than we experience on Earth's surface, which would support certain theories about the environmental conditions of their point of origin. A handful of reports from military personnel who claim to have been present at retrieval sites describe the beings in controlled environments with dramatically reduced lighting. The creatures apparently more comfortable, more active in near darkness than in the bright fluorescent conditions of a government facility. There are other physical details that recur in the witness literature. The neck is described as very thin, in some accounts thin to the point of appearing inadequate to support the enormous head it connects to. The feet are occasionally described as having 3 or 4 toes and are reported to be flat and wide, very different from the arched human foot. And there is something that many witnesses report that is harder to categorize, a quality of presence that extends beyond the physical description. An aura, for lack of a better word, though none of the witnesses who use that word are people who would normally use it. A sense that the being occupies not just physical space, but psychic space, that it is in some sense larger than its physical body, that it reaches into the room or the space around it in a way that has no name in our language. This quality of extended presence may be related to the communication method these beings appear to use. Direct mind-to-mind transfer of information, what is loosely called telepathy, but is, in the accounts of those who have experienced it, something considerably more structured and intentional than the word telepathy usually implies. When a tall gray communicates with a human subject, witnesses report that the experience is not like hearing a voice in their head. It is more like a file being deposited directly into their consciousness. Complex packages of meaning, imagery, and emotional context that arrive all at once, complete, and then slowly unfold over hours and sometimes days as the mind works to decode what it received. This has led some researchers to speculate that the beings do not experience time the way we do, that they are capable of compressing what for us would be a lengthy conversation into a single moment of transmission, and that the recipient then spends hours unpacking what was delivered in a fraction of a second. The question of whether the tall grays have a language in the conventional sense, an evolved system of sound-based symbolic communication, is genuinely unresolved. Most witnesses report no vocalization at all. A small number report hearing sounds during encounters, described variously as clicking, low humming, or a resonant tone that seems to come from the being's chest rather than its mouth, a sound almost more like a vibration than a voice. Whether these sounds are communication directed at the human or communication directed between beings that the human is incidentally detecting is unknown. What is clear is that the tall grays, as a category of entity, represent something that challenges every assumption our civilization has made about the nature of intelligence, the structure of consciousness, and the biology of mind. They are not like us. They are not a slightly upgraded version of us, or a version of what we might become, or a reflection of something from our own evolutionary past. They are, as nearly as the evidence permits us to say, something genuinely alien, shaped by conditions we have not yet fully imagined, by timescales we can barely conceive, and by purposes that we are only beginning to approach the edges of understanding. The question of where. Of all the mysteries surrounding the tall grays, the question of where they come from is simultaneously the most studied and the most contested. There are several leading theories, each drawing on different streams of evidence: stellar cartography, the testimony of contactees and abductees, the claims of government insiders, and the emerging field of exoplanetary science, and they do not all point to the same answer. It is possible that they don't need to. It is possible that the tall grays are not from a single point of origin, or that the question of where they originated is less meaningful for a civilization of their apparent age than the question of where they are now. The earliest serious attempt to link a specific stellar location to the gray phenomenon came not from a military intelligence source or a government researcher, but from a schoolteacher in Ohio named Marjorie Fish, working in the early 1970s from the star map, famously recalled and drawn by Betty Hill following her and Barney Hill's landmark abduction experience in 1961. Fish undertook a meticulous three-dimensional analysis of nearby star systems. Betty Hill had been shown the map by her captors during the encounter, and her recollection of it, drawn under hypnosis, was specific enough to be analytically useful. Fish created over 20 handmade models of nearby star systems before arriving at an interpretation that placed the map's origin point in the Zeta Reticuli system, a binary star system approximately 39 light-years from Earth. The Zeta Reticuli connection became the dominant theory in early UFO research, and it has never entirely lost its grip on the field. The two stars in the system, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli, are both slightly smaller and cooler than our Sun, and they are separated by a substantial distance, orbiting each other over an enormously long period. They are old stars, significantly older than our Sun, which means that any planets in their systems have had billions of additional years for biological and technological evolution to occur. If you are looking for a stellar system that could plausibly have generated a civilization old enough and advanced enough to be visiting Earth in craft that defy our current physics, Zeta Reticuli checks many of the relevant boxes. However, the Zeta Reticuli hypothesis has its critics, and they have valid points. The star map interpretation by Fish has been disputed on methodological grounds. The specific star pattern she identified as matching Betty Hill's drawing depends heavily on which stars you include and which you exclude from the analysis. Subsequent analysts looking at the same drawing have arrived at different candidate systems, and the scientific community remains largely unconvinced that a star map drawn under hypnosis by a trauma survivor constitutes reliable astronomical data. This does not mean the theory is wrong. It means that the evidence for it is circumstantial, as is so much of the evidence in this field. Other researchers, working from different streams of evidence, have proposed alternative stellar origins for the tall grays specifically. Dr. David Jacobs, a historian and UFO researcher who spent decades conducting hypnotic regression sessions with abduction experiencers, found that his subjects, when pressed for information about the being's origins, rarely received clear answers. The tall grays, when they addressed the question at all in the minds of those they communicated with, typically did so in ways that were either evasive or that communicated a concept the human mind struggled to translate. Several subjects came back from these sessions with the impression that the concept of a specific home world was somehow inapplicable, that the beings had been spacefaring for so long and had occupied so many different environments that the original point of their evolution was no longer a meaningful reference point for them. They were not from Zeta Reticuli or anywhere else in any sense that a human would recognize. They were from space itself, in much the same way that a sailor of the ancient world might have considered himself from the sea rather than from the port where he was born. This idea that the tall grays are not a civilization of planetary beings visiting us from a homeworld but rather a civilization that long ago transcended the planetary stage and has since been living and evolving in the space between stars, in enormous craft, in artificial habitats, in the vast darkness between suns, is one that recurs in the testimony of insiders who claim to have had official government contact with these beings. William Cooper, a former naval intelligence officer who went public with a series of explosive claims before his controversial death in 2001, stated that briefing documents he had seen while serving aboard the USS Mahan described the tall grays as a spacefaring species that has not had a home planet in tens of thousands of years. Cooper's claims are difficult to verify and have been disputed on multiple grounds, but the specific detail about their relationship to planetary habitation aligns with what other witnesses have reported independently. The question of their biological origins, the evolutionary environment that shaped the form we encounter today, is a separate matter from the question of where they currently operate from, and it is one that researchers have approached from a fascinating angle, working backwards from their physical characteristics to reconstruct the environment that would have produced those characteristics. This is essentially applied exobiology, using what we know about how evolution works to infer what kind of world would produce beings with the specific traits the tall grays demonstrate. The large dark eyes immediately suggest adaptation to low light conditions. On Earth, eyes of this relative size and light-gathering capacity are found in species that either live in darkness or have evolved in environments where light is scarce. If the tall grays evolved on a planet orbiting a dim star, a red dwarf, for example, or an older, cooler star like the Zeta Reticuli pair, their visual system might have been under evolutionary pressure to maximize light gathering. The absence of visible iris and pupil structure might represent extreme light sensitivity that makes rapid dilation and constriction unnecessary. In a consistently dark environment, you are always fully dilated. The thin body plan also tells a story. On Earth, slender, elongated body types tend to appear in species living in specific gravitational and atmospheric conditions. A planet with slightly lower gravity than Earth would, over millions of years of evolution, allow for taller body plans while requiring less robust musculature to support them. A planet with a thinner or different atmospheric composition might select for a respiratory system very different from ours. The narrow chest cavity that witnesses remark on might be explained by a breathing apparatus far more efficient than our own, or by a circulatory and metabolic system that requires far less oxygen processing than the human model. Some researchers have proposed that the tall grays breathe a gas mixture substantially different from our air, which would explain both the apparent physical adaptation and the reports that they seem uncomfortable in Earth's surface atmosphere. The large cranium is perhaps the most suggestive feature of all. On Earth, the evolution of large brains is associated with particular kinds of environmental and social pressure. The arms races of social cognition, the demands of tool use and language, the advantages of long-term planning in environments of complex uncertainty. Whatever drove the tall grays' ancestors toward greater cognitive capacity clearly did so with unusual intensity, or over an unusually long period, or both. Their heads are not just slightly larger than ours, they are dramatically, preposterously larger in a way that suggests an evolutionary history of cognitive development that dwarfs our own. If the human brain, developed over roughly 6 million years of hominid evolution, represents our current level of intelligence, then the implied brain of a tall gray, inside that vastly expanded cranium, represents something that makes our own cognitive architecture look like a prototype. Some researchers have pushed further than physiology and propose that the tall grays represent what our own species might look like in 1 million years if we continue down our current evolutionary and technological path. The large head, the reduced physical frame, the apparent shift from physical strength to cognitive and psychic capacity, the loss of visible emotion from the face, these are all things that some evolutionary biologists have tentatively projected as possible directions for human evolution under conditions of advanced technological civilization. This theory, sometimes called the time travel hypothesis or the future human hypothesis, suggests that what we are seeing is not an alien species species at all, but a version of ourselves from an unimaginably distant future, returning to study, guide, or influence the civilization that will eventually become them. The time travel hypothesis has powerful advocates and equally powerful critics. Its advocates point to the striking physical similarities between gray beings and certain projections of future human anatomy, to the apparent interest these beings take in human genetic material, and to a handful of contact reports in which the beings communicated something that witnesses interpreted as a deep personal investment in human survival. The kind of investment that would make sense if they were watching the survival of their own ancestors. Its critics point to the enormous logical paradoxes this theory creates, to the lack of any verified mechanism for time travel, and to the large body of contactee testimony in which the beings communicate origins that are clearly and specifically stellar rather than temporal. Whatever their biological origins, the question of their current operational bases is somewhat less mysterious, in the sense that there is more direct testimony about it, though less mysterious in this context is decidedly relative. Multiple independent streams of evidence, from military witnesses to contactee reports to document analysis, point to a tall gray presence that is not exclusively in space, but has deep roots on Earth itself. We will return to this subject in detail when we examine the underground base program. For now, it is enough to say that the tall grays appear to be present on Earth not merely as visitors, but in some sense as long-term residents, beings who have been interacting with this planet for so long that the distinction between home and here may have become meaningless for them, in much the same way that it is meaningless to ask whether a human family comes from a city they have inhabited for 10 generations. The deepest and most unsettling theory about the origins of the tall grays is one that emerges from the most sensitive and least verifiable tier of insider testimony, the suggestion that they did not merely evolve on another world and discover Earth, but that they have a specific, intentional, ownership-level relationship with Earth and with humanity, that they were here before we were, that what we call human evolution was not a purely terrestrial biological process, but one in which they were involved as architects, as cultivators, as engineers. This is not a fringe idea on the edges of UFO culture. It is a central claim that appears in briefing documents leaked from multiple sources, in the testimony of multiple military and intelligence insiders, and in the communications that thousands of contact experiencers report receiving directly from these beings. We will examine this claim in full when we turn to the subject of the genetic program, but it is important to flag it now because it fundamentally changes the nature of the question we are asking when we ask where the tall grays come from. If they seeded humanity, then in a meaningful sense, they come from wherever we come from. And wherever we come from, they were there first. Before history, the ancient record. If you want to understand the scope of the tall gray presence on Earth, you cannot start in 1947 with the Roswell crash. You cannot even start in the 20th century. You have to go back, much further back, to the earliest moments when human beings found ways to record what they saw, what they feared, and what they worshipped, because running through the ancient record of human civilization, in culture after culture that had no contact with each other, in periods spanning tens of thousands of years, there are images and descriptions that look unmistakably like what modern witnesses describe when they describe a tall gray encounter. The cave paintings of the Saharan Tassili Niger Plateau in what is now Algeria are among the most extraordinary and least discussed artifacts in human prehistory, created over an enormous span of time from roughly 10,000 BCE to approximately 2000 BCE. They depict the rock art of dozens of successive cultures who lived in what was then a green and fertile land before the desiccation of the Sahara turned it into the hostile terrain it is today. Many of the paintings are exactly what you would expect from prehistoric pastoral cultures: cattle, antelope, human figures in everyday scenes. But interspersed among these mundane images are something else entirely: tall, elongated figures with disproportionately large, rounded heads, featureless faces, and bodies that do not correspond to human anatomy. They are sometimes depicted standing apart from human figures, sometimes interacting with them, sometimes appearing to be the focus of ritual activity. Local traditions have long referred to these figures as the round-headed people or the great gods, depending on the translation. Mainstream archaeology categorizes them as shamanic or mythological figures, a product of the religious imagination. But their physical specificity, the exact proportions, the absence of normal facial features, the enormous heads, is difficult to dismiss as pure imagination when it matches so precisely what witnesses in our own time report seeing. The cave art of the American Southwest tells a parallel story. The Anasazi and their ancestors left thousands of rock art images across the canyon lands of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. And among these images are recurring depictions of beings that modern researchers have labeled the ant people or the star people. They appear frequently in the oral traditions of the Hopi and Navajo peoples, and the Hopi tradition in particular is remarkably specific. In the Hopi emergence stories, a category of beings called the ant people sheltered the Hopi ancestors underground during a period of great destruction on the surface, providing them with food and guidance until it was safe to emerge. The physical description of the ant people in Hopi tradition, tall, thin-limbed, large-headed, non-speaking, communicating through a form of direct knowing, is not difficult to recognize for anyone familiar with the modern tall gray literature. Are the Hopi describing beings from their mythology or beings from their history? The distinction may be less clear than it appears. Indigenous traditions around the world treat the separation between history and myth as a largely Western imposition, as an artifact of a particular relationship to time that privileges written records over oral transmission. The Hopi elders who maintain these traditions treat the ant people as real historical entities who actually interacted with their ancestors, not as metaphorical or symbolic figures. And given that oral traditions can preserve accurate historical information over spans of thousands of years, as has been demonstrated in cases where oral traditions about specific geological events have been confirmed by modern archaeology, the flat dismissal of indigenous testimony about non-human beings seems, at minimum, epistemically premature. Moving to the other side of the world, the ancient Dogon people of Mali and West Africa have been the source of one of the most provocative puzzles in the study of possible ancient contact with non-human intelligence. The Dogon's traditional cosmology includes remarkably accurate knowledge about the Sirius star system, specifically about Sirius B, the white dwarf companion to Sirius A, which is invisible to the naked eye and was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1862 and not photographed until 1970. The Dogon not only knew about Sirius B, they called it the smallest and heaviest of all stars, which is a correct description of a white dwarf. But they also knew about the 50-year orbital period of the two stars and drew representations of the elliptical rather than circular nature of the orbit. How did they know this? Their tradition's answer is unambiguous. They were taught it by beings from the Sirius system, beings they called the Nomo, who descended from the sky in a craft accompanied by fire and thunder. The mainstream academic response to the Dogon mystery has evolved over decades. An early argument that the Dogon simply picked up this knowledge from contact with Western astronomers in the 20th century has been largely discredited by the timeline of when the relevant traditions were recorded. The argument that the whole thing is a misinterpretation of Dogon cosmology by the researchers who first documented it, Marcel Griol and Germain Dieterlen, has more weight, but has itself been challenged by subsequent fieldwork, confirming the central elements of Griol and Dieterlen's account. What remains is a genuine puzzle, a pre-literate culture in sub-Saharan Africa possessing specific, accurate astronomical knowledge about a nearby star system, knowledge that by their own tradition was given to them by beings who arrived from that system. Whether those beings were the tall grays specifically or some other non-human intelligence is impossible to determine, but the pattern is consistent with what we find across dozens of ancient cultures. Sky beings who bring knowledge, who interact with human beings in physical reality, who sometimes live with them or near them for extended periods, and who eventually depart with promises or warnings about future return. The Sumerian civilization of ancient Mesopotamia, often described as the world's first complex urban civilization, provides what may be the most detailed and most debated account of contact between early humans and non-human intelligences in the ancient record. The Sumerian texts, thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from sites across modern Iraq over the course of 2 centuries of archaeological excavation, describe a category of beings called the Anunnaki, literally, those who came from heaven to earth. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian texts, are not gods in the abstract theological sense. They are physical beings who arrive from the sky, who establish cities and civilizations, who perform genetic experiments, who create human workers, and who depart and return on schedules determined by astronomical cycles. The controversial scholar Zecharia Sitchin spent decades arguing that the Sumerian Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet he identified as Nibiru, a theorized body with a long elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system approximately every 3,600 years. Sitchin's literal interpretation of the Sumerian texts has been criticized by mainstream Assyriologists, who argue that his translations take unacceptable liberties with the source material. But even critics of Sitchin's specific claims acknowledge that the Anunnaki texts describe beings with physical existence, technological capabilities, and a relationship to human beings that goes far beyond what is described in most other ancient mythological traditions. The Anunnaki don't just give humanity laws or wisdom, they create humans, genetically, from existing hominid stock mixed with their own genetic material. They operate mining facilities, they run administrative centers, they have conflicts among themselves that spill over into human politics. They are, whatever their true nature, described in terms that are far more consistent with physical, technological beings than with purely spiritual or symbolic entities. Whether the Anunnaki were the tall grays, or a different species, or a composite memory of several different non-human interactions occurring over many centuries, is a question the evidence cannot definitively answer. What the Sumerian record does establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the earliest literate civilization on Earth included in its foundational cosmology the claim that powerful beings had come from the sky, had interacted with humans physically and biologically, and had shaped human civilization in its earliest stages. This is not incidental mythology. These are the texts that the Sumerians considered their most important records, the basis of their legal, agricultural, astronomical, and spiritual systems. This is what they believed they knew about where they came from and who had put them there. The Egyptian record is equally rich, though somewhat more obscured by the layers of interpretation, religious, political, academic, that have accumulated over 3 millennia. The gods of ancient Egypt are conventionally understood as nature deities, symbolic figures, representations of cosmic forces. But there is a persistent undercurrent in Egyptological research that finds, beneath the symbolic layer, something that looks more literal. Descriptions of physical beings with specific physical characteristics, who lived in specific places, who built specific structures, who had specific relationships with the human pharaohs who claimed to speak for them. The tradition of the first time, Zep Tepi, describes a period before recorded Egyptian history when the gods themselves walked the earth and ruled directly, and the things they are described as doing during this period: building, teaching, recording, establishing the order of the world, are the activities of physical beings, not abstractions. The physical descriptions of Egyptian deities are conventionally explained as stylistic convention and symbolic representation, but some researchers have noted that the stylized depictions found on tomb walls and temple reliefs show figures that, when the artistic conventions of Egyptian representation are accounted for, would have been depicted as unusually tall, slender, and large-headed compared to the human figures shown alongside them. The pharaoh Akhenaten, often discussed in the context of ancient contact theories because of his radical religious reforms, his insistence on a single solar deity, his apparent break with all previous religious tradition, has a physical representation in art that is startling: an elongated skull, a narrow face, a thin torso, and an unusual body proportion that has given rise to both medical explanations. Marfan syndrome has been suggested, and more radical ones. The royal family depicted in Amarna art, Akhenaten's capital city, uniformly shares these unusual physical characteristics that, when laid beside the description of the tall grays, invite a particular kind of double take. The ancient record is fragmentary, contested, and subject to interpretations shaped by the assumptions of those doing the interpreting. But the accumulation of data points, from Tassili, from Hopi tradition, from the Dogon, from Sumer, from Egypt, and from dozens of other cultures we haven't even touched on, creates a pattern that is difficult to explain purely through the lens of parallel symbolic development or shared psychological archetypes. The beings described in these ancient accounts are too physically specific, too consistent in their behaviors and their relationships with humans, too deeply embedded in the most fundamental narratives of human civilization to be comfortably dismissed as imagination. Something was here. Something interacted with our ancestors. And the profile of what that something looked like, how it communicated, what it wanted, and how it related to human beings maps consistently onto the profile of the tall grays as described in modern encounter literature. The question that haunts this entire field of inquiry is one that becomes more pressing the further back you push the timeline. If they were here in the Neolithic, in the Sumerian era, in dynastic Egypt, in pre-Columbian America, if they have been interacting with us throughout the entire span of human civilization, then what is the nature of that relationship? Was it benevolent? Was it exploitative? Was it something that doesn't fit neatly into either category? Something that reflects a relationship between beings at such different levels of development and perspective that human moral categories may simply not apply? These are the questions that the ancient record raises and cannot answer. And they are the questions we will spend the rest of this program trying to address. The modern era, from Roswell to the present day. Whatever the full scope of the ancient relationship between the tall grays and humanity, the modern chapter of that story has a date that most researchers use as a starting point: July 2nd, 1947. The date that something made of metal, emitting strange radiation, carrying materials unlike anything in the American industrial inventory, came down outside Roswell, New Mexico. The date that the modern UFO era, in its official, documented, undeniable sense, began. The Roswell incident has been buried under so many layers of official denial, popular culture mythologizing, and partisan interpretation that getting to what actually happened is genuinely difficult. But certain facts are well established. An object crashed on the Foster Ranch, 75 miles north of Roswell. The United States Army Air Force's 509th Bomb Group, the most elite and highly classified military unit in the world at that time, the only unit authorized to carry atomic weapons, initially issued a press release stating that a flying disc had been recovered. Within 24 hours, that statement was retracted and replaced with the now famous weather balloon explanation, accompanied by a public display of materials that clearly did not match descriptions from the crash site. Key witnesses were silenced, some through debriefing, some through explicit threats. The debris field was cleaned with a thoroughness that required a very large number of military personnel and a very significant logistical effort, an effort wildly disproportionate to the recovery of a weather balloon. What was recovered at Roswell has been the subject of debate for more than 7 decades, but the most persistent and best attested claim from the most credible witnesses, people who had direct access, who handled materials, who were present at the site or at the processing facility at Fort Worth Army Airfield, is that among the debris, and possibly from a secondary crash site some distance from the main field, there were bodies, not human bodies. Bodies of beings that were small by human standards, slender, large-headed, large-eyed, with skin that was grayish in color and features that did not match any terrestrial species. Whether those recovered beings were what we are calling the short grays, the tall grays, or some combination thereof, has never been definitively established from the available testimony. But their existence, as a recovery that occurred, that was documented, that was transported to specific facilities and subjected to study, has been attested by enough credible witnesses, in enough detail, with enough corroborating consistency, to represent one of the most well-supported claims in the entire history of UFO research. Mortician Glenn Dennis, who worked at a Roswell funeral home and had a service contract with the RF base, stated that he received calls from the base in the days following the crash asking about the availability of small, hermetically sealed caskets and the proper procedures for preserving bodies that had been exposed to the elements. A nurse friend of his, who he identified only as Naomi and who he said died in an aircraft accident not long after, described performing or assisting at an autopsy of non-human bodies, describing the smell, the physical characteristics, the confusion of the personnel involved. First Lieutenant Walter Haut, who was the public information officer who wrote the original press release announcing the recovery of a flying disc, signed an affidavit that was sealed until after his death in 2005. In that affidavit, he stated that he had been taken to Hangar 84 and shown the craft and the bodies. He described an object roughly 20 feet in length and non-human occupants that were approximately 4 feet tall with large heads. Jesse Marcel Sr., the intelligence officer who went to the crash site and handled the debris, described materials with properties that matched no known alloy, metal foil that returned to its original shape after being crumpled, structural members engraved with symbols unlike any known language, and he maintained until his death that the official weather balloon explanation was a deliberate fabrication. Roswell is the beginning of the documented modern era, but it is far from the only significant event of the early period. The year 1952 saw a wave of UAP activity over Washington, D.C., so significant and so public that it became impossible to fully suppress. Radar returns confirmed by multiple civilian and military installations, visual observations by air crews, and public sightings from the National Mall itself forced the Air Force into a press conference that remains to this day one of the most awkward public communications exercises in the history of American military public affairs. General John Samford, then Director of Air Force Intelligence, acknowledged that some of the objects tracked on radar represented credible observers reporting relatively incredible things, carefully worded language that said rather more than a flat denial while committing to rather less than an acknowledgement. Behind the scenes of these public events, a parallel institutional reality was developing that would shape the entire subsequent relationship between the American government and the phenomenon it was encountering. Multiple insiders across several decades have testified to the existence of a control group, a small, extraordinarily well-protected committee composed of the most senior military, scientific, and intelligence figures. Established in the late 1940s to manage the UFO reality without bringing it into the arena of normal governmental oversight or public awareness. This group has been referred to by various designations across different streams of evidence: MJ-12, Majestic 12, Operation Majestic, PI-40, or simply the Control Group. Its existence is debated, its membership is debated, and its exact activities are debated, but the structural logic of its existence is not. Any government that recovered technology and biological material of extraterrestrial origin in the late 1940s, at the height of the Cold War, with the Soviet Union as an existential adversary, would have had overwhelming institutional incentives to compartmentalize that recovery to a degree that kept it out of ordinary governmental processes. The question is not really whether such a group existed, but what it decided and what it has been doing ever since. What the documentary record and insider testimony suggest it decided in the early 1950s was profoundly consequential: that the reality of non-human intelligence interacting with Earth could not be disclosed to the public without triggering social, religious, and economic disruption on a scale that would be unacceptable, and that in the meantime, the technical capabilities represented by recovered craft needed to be studied and, if possible, reverse engineered. Both of these decisions, non-disclosure and reverse engineering, required secrecy of a kind that went beyond normal classification. They required the creation of what some researchers call the Black World, a parallel technological and intelligence infrastructure operating entirely outside normal governmental accountability, funded through methods that bypass congressional oversight, and staffed by personnel whose knowledge of what they are working on can never be officially acknowledged. The implications of this for our story about the tall grays are significant. If the American government, and by extension, several allied governments, has been in possession of recovered gray technology and gray biological material for more than 7 decades, then the relationship between these beings and the world's most powerful governments is not simply one of observation from a distance. It is a relationship with a history of confrontations, recoveries, attempts at communication, eventually something approaching negotiation, and then, if certain insider accounts are accurate, something that looks very much like a formal agreement. The transition from confrontation to agreement is one of the most dramatic and least known chapters in modern history, if the accounts of those who claim to have witnessed or participated in it are accurate. In the early years after Roswell, the American military's relationship with the phenomenon was characterized by attempts at interception and the shocking discovery that those attempts were essentially futile. The craft that were being tracked and occasionally encountered by military pilots were, in terms of their performance envelope, simply incomparably superior to anything the Air Force could put in the air. Aircraft were damaged attempting intercepts. Pilots were occasionally lost in ways that were never publicly explained. The frustration of trying to respond militarily to something that could outperform every aircraft in the inventory by factors that seemed to defy physics was a significant driver of the institutional pressure to find an alternative approach. That alternative approach, according to multiple sources, involved the attempted establishment of communication and eventually the achievement of it. The contacts reported to have occurred in the early 1950s at locations including Muroc Army Air Base, now Edwards Air Force Base in California, and later at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, represent, if they occurred as described, some of the most consequential meetings in the history of the human race. A series of landed craft, beings stepping out to meet human officials, negotiations conducted through some form of communication technology or through translation provided by the beings themselves, and ultimately an agreement, or something that was understood by the human parties to be an agreement, though the extent to which both sides had the same understanding of what had been agreed to has been questioned ever since. The details of what was agreed to vary significantly between different sources, which is either a sign of the inherent unreliability of insider testimony or a reflection of the fact that the agreement evolved over time through multiple interactions. The most commonly reported elements include an exchange of technology in both directions. The beings would share certain technological knowledge with human scientists, and human governments would provide certain forms of assistance and access. A permission to take certain numbers of human beings for study and experimentation, on the condition that those individuals would be returned safely and their memories would be handled in some way. And a mutual secrecy agreement, whereby the human governments would not disclose the existence of the contact, and the beings would limit the visibility of their activities. Whether this framework constitutes a treaty in any meaningful legal sense, whether it was agreed to by beings who understood it as human authorities understood it, and whether it has been honored by either side, are among the most actively debated questions in UFO research. But the framework itself, its basic outline, appears across enough independent sources to suggest that something along these lines did occur. The modern era, then, is not simply the era of sightings and abductions, as the popular culture understanding of UFOs tends to frame it. It is the era of a secret, ongoing, profoundly consequential engagement between the human institutions that hold political and military power on this planet and beings of a nature and capability that represent the most significant reality humanity has ever encountered. Everything that has happened in the public dimension of this story, the sightings, the abductions, the crop circles, the cattle mutilations, the testimony of thousands of ordinary people who found themselves involved with entities they did not ask to encounter, has been happening against this backdrop of an institutional relationship that the public has not been invited to join. Understanding that is essential to understanding what the tall grays are doing here, because they are not simply explorers or tourists or scientists conducting independent field research. They are parties to an arrangement, and like all parties to arrangements of any kind, they have interests they are protecting, goals they are pursuing, and a timeline that may or may not align with the interests and timeline of those on the other side of the agreement. The agenda. What do they want? This is the question that sits at the center of everything. If you accept the premise that the tall grays are real, that they have been present on or near Earth for an extended period, that they have interacted with human beings across cultures and centuries, that they have recovered from some interactions with institutional humanity while continuing others, then the question of what they want is not merely a philosophical curiosity. It is the most practically important question a species can ask about another species that has the apparent power to do with them as it wishes. What do they want? What is the agenda that drives their presence, their interventions, their selections of specific human beings for contact, their apparent interest in human biology? What is the goal toward which all of these activities are pointed? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty. We may not know with certainty for a very long time. The beings themselves, when they communicate with human subjects, do so in ways that are selective, partial, and shaped by a perspective so different from our own that even accurate communication may produce misunderstanding. The institutional sources, the government insiders, and military witnesses who have had official contact, operate under conditions of classification, fear, and compartmentalization that prevent them from seeing the full picture, even when they are seeing something real. And the research community, for all its dedication, is working with data that is fragmentary, contested, and filtered through the very human tendency to interpret unfamiliar things in terms of familiar frameworks. What we can do is examine the evidence for different components of the agenda, the things these beings demonstrably do, the activities that can be documented across many independent accounts, the patterns of behavior that emerge from decades of carefully collected testimony, and try to understand what those activities are in service of. What does the behavior tell us about the goal, even when the goal is not stated directly? What can we infer from what they take, what they leave, what they change, and what they apparently regard as beyond their scope to touch? The first and most extensively documented component of the agenda is the collection and study of biological material from Earth. This covers an enormous range of activities, the well-documented phenomenon of cattle mutilations, in which livestock are found with surgical precision wounds, and the complete removal of specific organs and tissues with no tracks and no blood. The biological sampling that abductees consistently report, including tissue samples, reproductive materials, blood, and implantation of devices in soft tissues or near bone structures, and what appears to be a longer-term program of genetic cataloging and experimentation that has been described by researchers like Jacobs, John Mack, Bud Hopkins, and many others as the most consistent single thread running through decades of abduction literature. The cattle mutilation phenomenon is worth pausing on because it represents perhaps the most physically documented, most verifiable component of gray activity, even if it is also among the most disturbing. Since the 1960s, and with dramatically increasing frequency through the 1970s and 1980s, ranchers across the American West, and subsequently across every continent except Antarctica, have discovered cattle and other large animals dead in their fields under circumstances that defy conventional explanation. The surgical precision of the wounds is the most immediately striking characteristic. Specific organs are removed, typically the reproductive organs, the rectum, the eyes, the ears, parts of the tongue, and portions of the skin, with a cut quality that has consistently impressed forensic pathologists as unlike anything produced by conventional predation or by human surgical instruments. The cuts are sharp beyond what a conventional blade would produce, often appearing to have been made by something that simultaneously cut and cauterized at the cellular level. There is no blood at the scene, despite wounds that would, in a living animal, have produced enormous quantities of it. There are no tracks, not the hoof prints of a panicked animal, not the footprints of a human, not the paw prints of a predator. The carcass is sometimes found with evidence of having been dropped from a height, broken bones without external trauma, impact craters that don't match the position in which the animal was found. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states and countries have investigated these incidents, and the most honest of those investigations have concluded exactly what the witnesses themselves conclude. They don't know what is doing this. The predator theory doesn't hold up under pathological examination. The human cult theory has no evidence base and no established motive. The natural decomposition theory cannot account for the precision of the wounds or the absence of blood. The helicopter-borne human explanation struggles with the lack of tracks, the lack of witnesses in what are relatively inhabited areas, and the sheer scale of the phenomenon. Thousands of documented cases across decades in multiple countries involving logistics that would require an enormous and sustained covert operation if humans were responsible. What remains, when the conventional explanations are stripped away, is the inference that whatever is performing these procedures has a specific interest in specific biological materials, has the capability to take those materials without leaving detectable evidence, and has been conducting this program on a scale and with a consistency that suggests a systematic, ongoing scientific or industrial process rather than isolated incidents. What is the purpose of the biological material? This is where the agenda analysis becomes genuinely speculative, because we are inferring the purpose of sophisticated biochemical and genetic work from the outside without access to either the methodology or the results. But the patterns are suggestive. The specific tissues that are most consistently taken, reproductive organs, blood, glandular tissues associated with hormone production and neurochemistry, are exactly the tissues that would be most useful to someone seeking to understand and work with mammalian biology at the genetic and biochemical level. They are not the tissues you would take if you were interested in nutrition or in physical materials science or in toxicology. They are the tissues you would take if you were interested in genetics, in reproductive biology, in the endocrine system, and its role in development and cognition. This connects directly to the second major component of the documented agenda, the hybridization program. This is the most controversial, the most personally disturbing for those involved, and arguably the most consequential element of the tall gray presence on Earth. It is also, given the consistency with which it appears across thousands of independent accounts, one of the most difficult to dismiss. The hybridization program refers to what appears to be a long-running effort to combine human genetic material with the genetic material of gray beings, or beings associated with the tall grays, to produce a new category of hybrid entity that carries characteristics of both lineages. The evidence for this program comes from multiple directions. Abductees who undergo hypnotic regression or who recover memories through other means frequently describe being involved in procedures that are clearly reproductive in nature. Egg extraction from women, sperm collection from men, and subsequently, in follow-up encounters, being shown hybrid children or infants and encouraged to interact with them. The emotional content of these experiences, as reported by witnesses, is complex and often distressing. But the witnesses' distress does not make their accounts less consistent with each other. Dr. John Mack, the Harvard psychiatrist whose engagement with abduction accounts cost him significant professional standing, but whose intellectual rigor is difficult to fault, described his research subjects as experiencing a common thread of being shown hybrids and being asked to bond with them, to provide them with emotional contact that the beings raising them apparently could not supply. The hybrids in these accounts appear to be real children, physical beings, not visions or hallucinations, who are pale, thin, large-eyed, and who exist in an environment aboard a craft where they are cared for but seem somehow incomplete without human emotional input. The question of why a race of beings apparently possessed of enormous technological sophistication would need to run a hybridization program with humanity leads naturally into territory that challenges our assumptions about the tall grays' situation. The most common inference from the research community is that the tall grays face some form of biological crisis, a genetic bottleneck, a reproductive failure, an immune system so specialized or degraded that it can no longer adapt to changing environmental challenges. The narrow genetic diversity that would result from an enormously old civilization that long ago mastered the biological conditions of its home environment might, over geological time, produce exactly the kind of vulnerability that a hybridization program would seek to address. By introducing the genetic diversity, adaptability, and emotional richness of a younger, more biologically vibrant species into their lineage, the tall grays may be attempting to secure their own survival in a way that their existing biology cannot support. This theory, let's call it the genetic rescue hypothesis, has a certain elegance to it because it simultaneously explains the hybridization program, the extensive biological sampling, and the apparent tall gray interest in human emotions and emotional capacities. Multiple abductees report that the beings seem genuinely puzzled by human emotional experience, that they observe human emotional responses with something that reads as scientific curiosity, as if the capacity for the range of feelings that humans take entirely for granted is somehow remarkable, even enviable, from the perspective of beings who may have largely transcended or lost that capacity over the course of their long development. If what they are missing is not just genetic material, but the emotional and creative richness that comes with a biologically young and hormonally active species, then the hybridization program is not just about genetics. It is about reclaiming something they have lost, something that was perhaps more important to their wholeness than they understood until they had already lost it. The third major component of the agenda is harder to discuss without sounding like the most overheated kind of conspiracy theorizing, which is exactly why it has been relegated to the margins of even the UFO research community, despite appearing in sources that, when examined carefully, deserve more attention than they get. This is what some researchers call the social engineering component, the possibility that the tall grays are not merely studying human beings and collecting biological material, but are actively and deliberately shaping human development, cultural, political, technological, spiritual, in directions that serve their longer-term goals. The evidence for this is less direct than the evidence for the biological program, but it is not absent. Multiple insider sources across multiple decades have claimed that certain scientific and technological developments on Earth, specifically in the fields of semiconductors, fiber optics, night vision technology, and several other foundational technologies of the modern information age, were not entirely the product of independent human research, but were guided in specific directions by information that came from contact with non-human intelligence. The story of Jack Kasher, a physicist who studied early transistor technology, and the more controversial claims about what Bob Lazar described seeing at S4 near Area 51, both point in the direction of a technology transfer that was not purely passive, that humans were not simply discovering alien technology lying around and working out how it functioned, but were receiving guidance, being pointed towards specific problems to solve and specific approaches to take. If true, this would mean that the technological landscape of the 21st century, the information revolution, the digital world, the connected global civilization, is in part a product of non-human influence operating through human intermediaries, and the direction of that influence toward information technology, toward connectivity, toward the digitization of human knowledge and human society would not be accidental. It would reflect the tall grays' understanding of what a civilization needs to look like in order to be useful to their purposes. There is a fourth component of the agenda that operates at an even more fundamental level, and it is the one that some of the most thoughtful researchers in this field consider the most important: the spiritual or consciousness dimension. This is not a comfortable topic for a documentary attempting to maintain analytical rigor, because the moment you start talking about spirituality in the context of aliens, you invite the full weight of cultural skepticism about both subjects simultaneously. But the evidence that the tall grays are interested in human consciousness, in the nature of awareness, in the mechanisms of spiritual experience, in what happens to the human person at death, is extensive enough to demand serious treatment. A substantial proportion of contact experiencers report that the beings they encounter are as interested in questions of consciousness and spiritual development as they are in any biological material, They ask about experiences of love. They ask about near-death experiences. They are interested in dreams, in mystical states, in altered states of consciousness of all kinds. They communicate information about the nature of reality that consistently touches on the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. And they return again and again to themes of interconnection, the idea that all consciousness is related, that the separation between individual minds is in some sense illusory, that what we call self is a construct that more advanced consciousnesses have learned to see through. Whether these communications are genuine knowledge being shared or carefully constructed influence being deployed for ulterior purposes is impossible to assess from outside. But the consistency with which these themes appear in contact reports from all over the world, from people who have never read UFO literature and who would not have known what to expect from such an encounter, suggests that they represent something real about what these beings are doing and why they are doing it. The picture of the agenda that emerges from a careful synthesis of all these components is not a simple or comfortable one. It is not the agenda of simple colonizers or slavers. There is no evidence that the tall grays want to occupy Earth physically or to replace human civilization with their own. It is not the agenda of benevolent guides who have simply come to help us. Too much of what they do is extractive, non-consensual, and shaped by their own needs rather than ours. What emerges is something more complex, the agenda of a very old civilization that is in some form of crisis, that has a deep and long-established relationship with Earth and its human population, that needs things from us that it cannot simply take without some form of engagement, and that is operating on a timeline and with a set of priorities that may make their activities look very different from the inside than from our exterior vantage point. They are not our friends, not in the simple sense. They are not our enemies, not in the simple sense. They may be something for which our moral vocabulary, calibrated for relationships between beings at roughly equivalent levels of development and power, simply doesn't have the right words. The abduction phenomenon, first-hand witnesses to the agenda. No discussion of the tall grays and their agenda can proceed without a sustained engagement with the abduction phenomenon. This is the body of evidence that puts human beings in direct physical contact with these entities, not as distant observers, not as analysts of physical trace evidence, but as participants in whatever the tall grays are doing, whether they consented to that participation or not. The abduction phenomenon is the most intimate, the most contested, and in many respects, the most revealing window we have into the nature of the beings we are discussing. The term abduction was established in the UFO research community through the work of Bud Hopkins, an artist who became one of the most important investigators of the phenomenon, and subsequently through the work of David Jacobs and John Mack. What the term refers to is a specific pattern of experience that has been reported by millions of people across every country, every culture, and every demographic category, an experience of being taken, typically at night, often from one's bedroom, by non-human beings, transported to a craft or facility, subjected to physical examination and various procedures, and then returned, often with gaps in memory that may be total or may be partial. The experience is almost universally reported as unwanted and frightening in its initial phases, though the emotional aftermath is more complex. Some experiencers go on to have what they describe as transformative, even profound contact that changes their understanding of reality in ways they value, while others are left with lasting trauma, phobias, and psychological distress that disrupts their lives. The scale of the phenomenon is staggering when you look at the numbers. A 1991 Roper poll commissioned by Hopkins, Jacobs, and Mack and conducted by a mainstream survey organization found that approximately 2% of the adult American population reported clusters of experiences consistent with the abduction phenomenon, including waking up paralyzed, seeing unusual lights in a bedroom, missing time, experiencing sensations of flying, and discovering strange marks or injuries on their bodies with no remembered explanation. If that 2% figure is even approximately accurate, it translates to millions of people in the United States alone who have had experiences consistent with the abduction profile. Extrapolated globally, the number becomes almost too large to comprehend. Critics of the abduction research have raised important methodological objections, and they deserve to be taken seriously. The reliance on hypnotic regression to recover memories has been challenged by memory researchers who point out that hypnosis is not a reliable method for recovering accurate memories. It can produce confabulation, suggestion-driven memory creation, and the compression of real and imagined experiences into a single narrative that the subject believes is accurate. The psychological explanation that abduction memories represent a form of sleep paralysis combined with vivid hypnagogic hallucination shaped into a culturally specific narrative by media exposure to alien imagery has been advanced by serious researchers and cannot be entirely dismissed. The suggestion that some abduction experiences may represent genuine psychological experiences, profound, meaningful, reality-altering, without necessarily involving physical beings performing physical actions, is also worth considering. But the psychological explanations, however important, fail to account for several categories of data that fall outside their explanatory scope. They don't explain the physical evidence, the marks and wounds that appear on abductees' bodies following experiences, some of which have been documented medically, the implants that have been recovered from abductees' bodies by physicians subjected to materials analysis and found to be composed of elements in configurations not found in natural environments. The cases of simultaneous abductions involving multiple witnesses who independently report the same events, and the cases where children report experiences consistent with the abduction phenomenon before they have had any exposure to alien imagery or popular culture representations of it. The psychological explanation also struggles with the international and cross-cultural consistency of the abduction experience. The fact that an indigenous person in Brazil, a factory worker in rural England, and a suburban housewife in Minnesota report experiences that match each other in specific technical detail, involving beings and procedures they had no known cultural exposure to. What do the abduction accounts specifically tell us about the tall grays? There is an important distinction to establish first. In the majority of abduction accounts, it is the smaller grays who perform the hands-on work, who appear at the bedside, who escort the experiencer to the craft, who conduct the examinations. The tall grays appear less frequently in the procedural phases of the abduction and more frequently in what might be called the communication phases, the moments when the human subject is not being examined but is being spoken to, shown things, tested in ways that seem cognitive or spiritual rather than biological. The pattern is consistent with the hierarchical relationship described earlier, the small grays as the workers, the tall grays as the authorities. When a tall gray does make direct contact with a human subject in an abduction scenario, the experience is consistently described as qualitatively different from interaction with the smaller beings. There is a weight to the presence and intensity of attention that witnesses struggle to describe. Several abductees across multiple decades of research have reported that the tall gray who engaged with them seemed to know them, not in the social sense, but in a deep biographical sense. They knew things about the person's life that the person had not told anyone. They referenced events, fears, and moments of joy in ways that made clear they had been watching, studying, documenting this individual for an extended period. Some experiencers, when they looked into the black eyes of a tall gray at close range, reported an experience of falling, as if the eyes were not surfaces but depths, as if looking into them initiated some process of direct cognitive or emotional exchange that was overwhelming in its completeness. The communication that tall grays initiate with human subjects during abductions covers a remarkable range of content. Some of it is clearly operational. Instructions, information about what is happening and why, explanations offered in terms that the human can process. But much of it is what researchers have come to call the message, a body of content that appears across thousands of independent accounts, delivered in various ways, but consistently addressing the same themes: the condition of Earth's environment and the threat humanity poses to it, the nature of human consciousness and its potential for development, the interconnection of all living things, and the violence done by the human assumption of separateness, warnings about specific future events, and repeatedly, insistently, images and concepts having to do with the future of human civilization and the role of the experiencer within it. The environmental content of the message is particularly striking in retrospect. Abductees beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, long before climate change became a mainstream concern, were being shown images of ecological catastrophe, dying oceans, burning forests, human populations in crisis, a planet stripped of its living complexity. They were being told that the trajectory of human civilization was heading toward a point of catastrophic irreversibility. They were asked, some of them felt they were recruited, to carry this awareness back into the human world and to act on it in whatever way their lives permitted. Whether this represents genuine concern for the Earth's biosphere on the part of the tall grays, calculated messaging designed to produce specific behaviors in the human subjects they were using, or some combination of the two, is impossible to determine from outside. But the consistency and the early timing of this messaging is difficult to explain purely as cultural contamination from environmental consciousness that hadn't yet developed in the wider culture. The most psychologically transformative component of the abduction experience, by the accounts of many who have undergone it, is not the physical examination and not even the direct communication from tall grays, but something that happens in certain encounters that might be called the ontological shock. A moment in which the experiencer's fundamental understanding of reality is not just challenged, but dismantled and rebuilt at a basic level. This can take many forms. Sometimes it is an experience of being shown a reality that contains the current physical world as a subset, a perception of additional dimensions, or of the world they normally inhabit as a kind of filtered or limited version of a larger whole. Sometimes it is an experience of total knowing, a moment in which everything that needs to be understood is understood, and the understanding then retreats when normal consciousness returns, leaving the person with the certainty that they knew something immeasurably important for a brief moment, and the frustration of being unable to bring it back. And sometimes it is a specific communication about the nature of the beings themselves, about what they are, what they have been, what the relationship between them and humanity truly is, that changes everything the experiencer thought they understood about the world. The accounts of these moments of deep disclosure are remarkably consistent in one particular respect. The tall grays, when they choose to reveal themselves at the deepest level, do not present themselves as superior beings doing humanity a favor by making contact. They present themselves as relatives, as beings with a specific, ancient, reciprocal relationship with humanity that goes far deeper than observers and observed, far deeper than collectors and collected. The word that comes up again and again across cultures and decades and wildly different experiencer backgrounds is family. In whatever sense that word translates across such a vast difference of form and origin, the tall grays appear in these deepest moments of contact to be claiming kinship. And the implication of that claim that whatever they are doing to us, whatever they are taking from us, whatever they are working toward with their hybridization program and their biological cataloging and their careful management of human consciousness, is not the work of strangers exploiting a resource, but the work of relatives, however alien, however powerful, navigating a relationship whose full history neither side can entirely see. The whistleblowers, those who broke the silence. In any massive, decades-long cover-up, if that is what the UFO secrecy represents, the greatest threat to the secrecy is the same as it always has been: people. People who know things and cannot bear to carry that knowledge forever. People who, approaching the end of their lives, decide that the obligation to history outweighs the oaths they took to institutions they no longer entirely trust. People who watch the public discourse about their area of knowledge proceed in ignorance and find the cognitive dissonance unbearable. The UFO secrecy has produced an extraordinary number of such people, and a meaningful number of them have spoken with enough specificity, enough corroboration, and enough personal credibility that their testimony cannot be responsibly dismissed. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso occupies a special place in this history. Corso served in the United States Army for more than 2 decades, reaching the senior staff of the National Security Council under President Eisenhower, serving in the Army's Research and Development Division, and retiring with a distinguished record. In 1997, 2 years before his death, he published The Day After Roswell, co-authored with journalist William J. Burns, which made claims that were sensational enough to be immediately attacked but specific enough that the attacks often missed the mark. Corso's central claim was that he had personally handled materials recovered from the Roswell crash while working in Army R&D in the early 1960s, and that his job had involved seeding these materials anonymously through cutouts in a way that would not reveal their origin to defense contractors and research institutions that could study them and develop them into workable technologies. The materials he described included fiber optic fibers, integrated circuit components, night vision devices, and others. He claimed that many of the foundational technologies of the modern electronic age were not purely the product of human ingenuity, but were the product of human ingenuity working backward from examples that were not of human manufacture. Corso's critics have noted inconsistencies in his timeline and have questioned some of the specific technical claims. But his book was written not as a comprehensive technical treatise, but as a first-person memoir, and the first-person elements, the specific operational details, the institutional context, the specific chain of custody for recovered materials, are the kind of content that would be very difficult to fabricate convincingly. His account has been partially corroborated by other witnesses who served in overlapping institutional environments, and the broad thesis that non-human technology was recovered and that its study was outsourced to the defense industrial base in a way that obscured its origin appears across enough independent sources to deserve serious consideration. Colonel Jesse Marcel Jr., son of the intelligence officer who was present at the Roswell debris field, spent his career as a physician and military flight surgeon, retiring with the rank of colonel. He held security clearances throughout his career. In interviews before his death in 2013, he was measured, careful, and specific. He described the materials his father brought home from the debris field as nothing he had ever seen before or since. Structural members with symbols on them unlike any known writing system, metallic material that had properties he had never seen in any conventional material. He did not speculate wildly about what it all meant. He simply described what he saw as a child and maintained that the official explanation was false. His restraint actually makes his testimony more compelling, not less. The case of Brigadier General Arthur Exon requires particular attention because of the institutional position from which he is speaking. Exon was a test pilot and senior officer who served at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which multiple independent sources identify as the primary facility for processing recovered non-human craft and biological material. In interviews with researcher Kevin Randall in 1990, Exon confirmed that something extraordinary had been recovered at Roswell, describing the material as foreign to this Earth, and confirming that bodies had been recovered and analyzed at Wright-Patterson. He described what amounted to an informal but effective group of senior officials who handled decisions about the recovered material and its study. He also made a statement that is echoed through subsequent research, that the group in charge of this material operated with an independence from normal command structure that made it essentially self-governing, that the normal chain of command, even up to the level of the president, did not necessarily have access to what this group was managing. This claim that the UAP secrecy program has operated with an independence that places it beyond normal executive oversight, up to and including the presidency itself, has been confirmed in various forms by multiple subsequent witnesses. President Clinton is reported to have received a briefing that left him unsatisfied with the information he was given, that he understood he was not being told everything. President Carter, who had his own UFO sighting and who pledged as a presidential candidate to release all UFO information, found after reaching the White House that there were classification structures he could not override. President Obama, when asked about UFOs, made statements about a secret government operating independently that were ambiguous enough to be either humor or carefully worded candor. The pattern across multiple administrations is consistent with what Exon described, a compartmentalization so deep and so well established that even the occupants of the highest constitutional offices in the land are not necessarily inside it. James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, is a tragic figure in this story, whose fate has been used by some researchers as evidence of the personal cost of knowing too much. Forrestal was one of the senior officials present at the very beginning of the institutional response to the UFO reality and his deteriorating mental and physical condition in the years between 1947 and his death in 1949. Officially ruled a suicide from a high window at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he was confined without his own consent, has been interpreted by some as evidence of a man broken by knowledge he could not share and could not act on. This is speculative, and mainstream historians have attributed his breakdown to the pressure of his responsibilities and a clinical depressive episode. But the timing, the circumstances of his confinement, and the behavior of government officials during his last weeks have generated enough questions that the convenient suicide explanation has never fully satisfied everyone who has examined it. Among the more recent generation of disclosure advocates, the testimony of Luis Elizondo stands out for its institutional specificity. Elizondo is the former director of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the classified Pentagon UFO research program, whose existence was officially confirmed in December 2017 when the New York Times reported on it in an article that briefly rearranged the entire media landscape before the story was buried by other news. Elizondo resigned from the Pentagon in protest over what he described as institutional resistance to taking the phenomenon seriously, and he has been careful in his public statements, never claiming more than he says he can verify, but making claims that, within those limitations, are significant. He has stated that the objects being tracked by military sensors demonstrate flight characteristics that cannot be explained by any known human technology. He has stated that there is a bureaucratic and institutional resistance to engaging with this reality that goes beyond normal institutional inertia, and he has used language about the nature of what these objects are that stops just short of explicitly confirming their non-human origin while leaving very little room for any other interpretation. The testimony of Bob Lazar, who claims to have worked at a classified facility called S4, adjacent to Area 51 in the late 1980s, is among the most controversial in this field. Lazar claims to have been tasked with the reverse engineering of propulsion systems from recovered non-human craft. Specifically, understanding how a system he described as using element 115, ununpentium, later synthesized by human scientists and officially named moscovium, as a fuel could generate the kind of gravity distortion that would explain the observed performance of the objects. His story has been examined forensically for decades, with investigators confirming some biographical details he provided while being unable to confirm others. His descriptions of the craft's characteristics and the operational environment at S4 have been detailed enough and have incorporated enough physics that was not publicly known at the time to make simple fabrication an unsatisfying explanation. Whether Lazar is exactly what he says he is, somewhat more or somewhat less, the combination of his specific technical claims with the corroborating element, that the element he described as central to the craft's propulsion, element 115, was later synthesized and found to have unusual properties, gives his account a staying power that pure dismissal cannot account for. Among the most significant documents in the whistleblower literature are the briefing papers that have been attributed to the MJ-12 control group. The collection of documents first surfaced in the mid-1980s, purporting to be official government briefing materials describing the recovery of crashed craft and non-human biological entities, and the establishment of a control structure to manage this reality. The authenticity of these documents has been debated with extraordinary intensity. Some elements of them have been confirmed as consistent with authentic, classified document formatting of the period. Others have been challenged as inconsistent with what researchers know about how the relevant agencies operated. The consensus in the research community is that some of these documents may be authentic, some may be fabrications, and some may be authentic documents that have been modified or combined with fabricated elements in ways that make clean authentication impossible. This ambiguity is itself interesting. It is exactly what you would expect if a sophisticated intelligence operation were involved in managing what information about these materials reach the public. What matters for our purposes is the content that appears consistently across the authenticated or partially authenticated documents. Confirmation of multiple crash and recovery events, confirmation of non-human biological material, confirmation of the establishment of a control structure specifically designed to operate outside normal governmental accountability, and, most significantly for our understanding of the tall grays, descriptions of the beings recovered that are consistent with what witnesses across completely different channels of evidence describe. The documents, whatever their precise provenance, are describing the same things that the insiders are describing, and the abductees are describing, and the ancient historical record is pointing toward. The convergence is the evidence. The most recent and most institutionally significant development in the whistleblower tradition is the testimony delivered to Congress in 2023 by David Grusch, a former intelligence official who served in the UAP task force. Grusch testified under oath before the House Oversight Committee that the United States government is in possession of non-human intelligence craft and non-human biological material, and that programs related to this material have been deliberately concealed from congressional oversight through illegal means. He named specific individuals who he claimed could corroborate his testimony if provided appropriate legal protection. He described a world of unacknowledged special access programs that operate with a degree of independence from constitutional governance that he characterized as deeply concerning from a democratic accountability standpoint. Congressional investigators who interviewed Grusch and the additional witnesses he identified have reportedly confirmed the core substance of his claims to a degree sufficient to warrant ongoing investigation. The significance of Grusch's testimony is not simply in what he said, though what he said was extraordinary, but in the institutional context in which he said it. This was not a retired officer speaking at a UFO conference. This was an active government official speaking under oath to an official congressional committee about matters that constitute, if true, one of the largest and most consequential secrets in human history. The institutional machinery around him, the protections provided by congressional testimony, the subsequent investigations by multiple committees, the legal framework of whistleblower protection that allowed him to speak, all represent a genuine shift in the institutional treatment of this subject. The century of official denial and institutional ridicule has not ended, but it has cracked in ways that were not possible before. Underground, the secret infrastructure. One of the most consistently reported and least publicly known aspects of the tall gray presence on Earth is what the research community has come to call the Underground Base Program, a network of subsurface facilities, some operated by human agencies, some operated by non-human entities, and some jointly operated, that are described with remarkable consistency by insider sources who have no obvious connection to each other. This is the aspect of the UFO reality that lives farthest from the acceptable edge of public discourse. Even most UFO researchers approach it with significant qualification, but the evidence base for it, when examined without prior skepticism, is surprisingly robust. The most famous claimed site is Dulce, New Mexico, a small town on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation in northern New Mexico. The Dulce base story entered UFO lore in the 1980s through a combination of sources. Thomas Edwin Costello, a man who claimed to be a former security officer at the facility; Paul Benowitz, an electronics engineer who began receiving what he believed were transmissions from underground craft in the area, and a collection of photographs and documents attributed to Costello that purported to show the interior of a multi-level underground facility operated jointly by human personnel and non-human beings. The Dulce story has been used as a case study in how UFO research can go wrong. Benowitz's investigation appears to have been actively compromised by intelligence operatives who fed him false and distorted information, and several elements of the Costello claims have never been independently verified. But the existence of underground facilities in the American Southwest, not necessarily exactly where the Dulce story places them, but in the general region, is supported by evidence that predates and postcedes the Dulce controversy. Geological surveys of the region have produced anomalous readings consistent with large artificial cavities. Military and government contracting activity in the area has generated a paper trail suggestive of significant infrastructure development, and accounts from Native American communities in the region particularly from the Jicarilla Apache and Taos Pueblo peoples, consistently describe a presence of unusual activity, strange lights, underground sounds, unusual military overflights, that their traditions connect to beings who live underground and interact with humans on terms that are neither benevolent nor purely hostile. The broader principle that the tall grays maintain some form of subsurface infrastructure on Earth is supported from several independent directions that have nothing to do with the Dulce story specifically. Military pilots and personnel who have been stationed at remote bases in the American West, in Australia, and in several other locations have described installations where unusual activities are conducted, areas of the facility that are off-limits, not just to ordinary personnel, but to senior officers without specific clearances, activities that occur at unusual hours and are never logged through normal channels, occasional glimpses of what are described as non-human occupants or equipment of clearly non-human manufacture. The descriptions of these facilities, when compared across independent sources who would have had no contact with each other, show a level of convergence that is difficult to explain through parallel fabrication. The joint facility model, the idea that underground bases represent a shared human-alien infrastructure built as a component of whatever agreement was reached in the 1950s, has been described by several sources who claim different levels of access. Some describe the arrangement as essentially collaborative, human scientists working alongside gray beings in facilities that combine both parties' technological capabilities, with each side having access to areas and information that the other does not. Others describe a relationship that has deteriorated from whatever collaborative equilibrium it may once have had, with non-human entities operating in sections of these facilities that human personnel are no longer able to enter, doing things that the human institutional partners can no longer monitor or control. The darkest version of this story, that the agreement has been repeatedly violated, that the number and nature of human subjects taken without consent has far exceeded what was negotiated, and that the human institutions involved lack the technical capability to enforce any of the terms they thought they had secured, appears across multiple sources with enough consistency to constitute a pattern, even if the specific details differ. The question of what is happening in these underground facilities, the nature of the research, the nature of the relationships between the parties involved, the ultimate purpose of the infrastructure, is one that the available evidence cannot fully answer. What we can say is that the existence of some form of non-human infrastructure on or near Earth is not a fantasy of fringe culture. It is something that appears in the testimony of credible witnesses, in patterns of documented governmental activity, and in the consistent reports of contact experiencers who describe being taken underground rather than aboard spacecraft. The subterranean dimension of the tall gray presence is, in some respects, the most physically proximate, and therefore the most politically sensitive, aspect of the entire phenomenon. If there are facilities on Earth where non-human beings are operating beyond the reach of any democratic accountability, then the implications for concepts like sovereignty, security, and governance are profound in ways that may explain why this aspect of the story is so persistently and aggressively suppressed. Technology, what they gave, what they kept. The tall grays, by any assessment of the evidence, possess technology that is incomprehensibly beyond anything humanity has developed or is likely to develop through purely conventional scientific progress in the near term. The craft associated with them, whatever their precise relation to the beings, whether they are manufactured by them, operated by them, or represent a technological legacy from even older civilizations, perform in ways that the known laws of physics, as understood by contemporary aerospace engineering, cannot explain. This is not the assessment of fringe researchers. It is the assessment of senior military and intelligence officials, aerospace engineers, and physicists who have studied the phenomenon with the resources of classified government programs. The flight characteristics that most consistently appear in credible military sensor data and witness accounts represent a specific cluster of capabilities. extreme acceleration from a standstill to velocities exceeding anything in the human inventory, achieved in fractions of a second with no visible exhaust, no visible propulsion system, and no sonic boom. Extreme maneuverability, including instant directional reversals at high speed that would destroy any aircraft made of conventional materials and kill any human occupant through gravitational force. Operation in multiple environments, transitioning from air to water to apparent space without any change in the basic operational mode of the craft. And the characteristic that is perhaps most physically puzzling, apparent defiance of inertia. When these objects make sharp turns at high velocity, they do not bank and lose altitude. They simply change direction as if inertia, the most fundamental and universal mechanical principle in Newtonian physics, does not apply to them. The only conceptual framework in contemporary physics that can potentially account for these characteristics is the manipulation of space-time itself, the kind of gravitational engineering that remains theoretical in human science, but that theorists like Miguel Alcubierre and Harold Sonny White have sketched the mathematical outlines of. A craft that could locally manipulate the curvature of space-time around itself would not be subject to conventional inertia, because from its own reference frame, it would be stationary while the space-time around it moved. It would not need to expend conventional propulsive energy to change direction, because changing the shape of its space-time bubble would redirect its relationship to the surrounding space-time without any application of force in the conventional sense. And it would not produce sonic booms or heat signatures because it would not be moving through the air in the sense that a conventional aircraft does. It would be carrying its own local space-time region with it. This kind of gravitational engineering would require an understanding of physics that goes well beyond the standard model, beyond the electromagnetic force, the nuclear forces, and gravity as described by general relativity, towards some unified understanding of all forces that allows them to be manipulated in coordinated ways. The energy requirements, by conventional calculations, would be enormous, on the order of the mass energy of a planet, to generate the kind of space-time curvature that would make this technology practical. Unless, that is, there is a physics we don't know, operating with principles we haven't discovered, that makes the energy budget of this kind of gravitational engineering radically more accessible than current theoretical estimates suggest. Bob Lazar's claims about element 115 as a fuel for gravity wave generation are interesting in this context because they represent an attempt to describe a mechanism, however imperfectly understood, for how a material substance could be used to drive a gravity-based propulsion system. Whether or not Lazar's specific account is accurate in every detail, the basic concept that an unusual atomic structure could produce gravitational effects usable for propulsion has not been ruled out by subsequent physics, and the synthesis of moscovium, element 115, and its study has produced results that are at least interesting in the context of his claims, even if they fall short of confirming them. The question of what technology has been transferred from the tall gray technological inventory to human civilization, deliberately by the beings, deliberately by human institutions working with recovered material, or inadvertently through the study of crash debris, is one of the great unanswered questions of the modern technological era. Corso's claims about seeded technology going to defense contractors in the 1960s, if accurate, would suggest that some of the foundational building blocks of the information age are derivatives of non-human technology. The specific technologies he claimed were seeded: fiber optics, integrated circuits, accelerated particle beam devices, night vision technology, are foundational to the modern world in ways that it is difficult to fully appreciate, because we have lived with them long enough to take them for granted. The integrated circuit is particularly interesting from this perspective. The transistor was invented in 1947 at Bell Labs by William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, the same year as the Roswell crash. The rapidity with which the conceptual leap from vacuum tubes to solid-state transistors was made, and the subsequent rapidity of miniaturization in integrated circuit technology has been commented on by technology historians as representing an unusually fast pace of development. This doesn't, by itself, prove anything. Technological development often appears to accelerate at certain inflection points, driven by converging advances in materials science, fabrication technique, and theoretical understanding. But the timing invites the question, And the question is one that current technology historians cannot answer, because if some of the inspiration for these developments did come from non-human sources, the evidence for that would be classified at levels that academic researchers cannot reach. The technology that the tall grays demonstrably have not shared, the core of their propulsion and energy systems, the full extent of their material science, the mechanisms of their communication and computation, represents a gap that is arguably more significant than what they may have provided. If the comparison is to a civilization whose gravitational engineering is functional, whose understanding of space-time is operational rather than theoretical, whose information processing capability dwarfs anything in the human inventory, then the technologies associated with the modern information revolution, as impressive as they are by human historical standards, are not in the same order of magnitude. We have been given, if we have been given anything, a jump forward along the same basic technological track we were already on. We have not been given the fundamental keys to a radically different relationship with physics and with energy, and that distinction between an incremental advancement along the existing track and a transformative shift to a different track entirely may be the most important thing about the technology transfer question. Why would the tall grays, if they have shared any technology at all, stop so far short of sharing the foundational principles that drive their own capabilities? The answers that have been proposed range from the benevolent to the strategic to the alarming. The benevolent interpretation is that a civilization with operational gravity control and the energy to match cannot simply hand those tools to a civilization that has not yet resolved the question of whether to use its existing tools constructively or destructively, that giving humanity access to gravitational engineering before we have developed the ethical and social infrastructure to use it responsibly would be extraordinarily dangerous, not just to us, but to the wider cosmic neighborhood. The strategic interpretation is that in a relationship defined by asymmetric power, the more powerful party does not give away the source of that asymmetry without very good reason. And the alarming interpretation is that the technology gap is not an accidental feature of the relationship, but a designed one, that the tall grays have an active interest in humanity remaining dependent, remaining technologically inferior, remaining manageable by a civilization that can reach our star system while we cannot yet leave our own. The genetic program. Deep design of humanity. We arrive now at the most fundamental and most radical dimension of the tall gray presence on Earth, one that, if the evidence for it is credited, requires a complete revision of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we got here. The genetic program encompasses everything from the ancient claims about the creation of humanity to the modern abduction experiences involving reproductive procedures to the hybridization program and the apparent tall gray investment in what human consciousness becomes. It is the program, if it exists, that gives the tall gray's relationship with humanity its deepest roots and its most complex ethical valence. The biological evidence begins with our own genome. Human DNA is, by the standards of the primate order, unusual. We have 46 chromosomes, while all other great apes have 48. The difference is accounted for by what geneticists call chromosome 2 fusion, a joining of two chromosomes that would have required an extraordinary, specific mutation event that essentially every modern human shares. The probability of this specific fusion occurring by random mutation and then becoming universal in the human lineage, sweeping through the ancestral population to the point where no original 48 chromosome humans remain, challenges conventional population genetics. This doesn't mean it didn't happen by natural means. Geneticists have proposed mechanisms, but it is one of the markers that make the human genome unusual in ways that have prompted serious evolutionary biologists to acknowledge the question, even if they dispute the non-mainstream answers to it. The genetic distance between humans and our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees, with whom we share approximately 98.7% of our coding DNA, has been described as inconsistent with the pace of evolution that would be expected in the time available between our apparent common ancestor and the emergence of anatomically modern humans. The rapidity of human cognitive development, the explosion of brain capacity, symbolic thought, language, and culture in the period between approximately 2 million years ago and 200,000 years ago is something that evolutionary biologists struggle to explain entirely through conventional natural selection. What selective pressure produced in geological blink of an eye, a brain of the sophistication and versatility that the human brain represents. The standard answers invoke the social complexity of early human groups, the feedback loops between tool use and cognitive development, and the advantages of theory of mind in competitive social environments. These are valid answers, but they don't fully close the gap between the pace of human cognitive development and what we would expect from a purely random process of variation and selection. The Sumerian texts, read literally rather than symbolically, describe a specific genetic intervention, the creation of a new species of worker humans by combining the genetic material of an existing hominid species with the genetic material of the Anunnaki. The technical language used in the texts, despite being 4,000 years old and filtered through translation, describes a process of mixing blood, or essence, in a way that sounds more like laboratory procedure than theological metaphor. The resulting being, described as the Lulu, or primitive worker, is explicitly not a natural evolutionary product, but a deliberate creation, shaped for a purpose, limited in specific ways, and subject to the ongoing interest of its creators. Whether or not we take the Sumerian texts as literal history, they represent the most ancient surviving textual claim about the non-natural origin of the human species. And they describe a process that is strikingly consistent with what modern genetics would call a directed hybridization or genetic modification event. Modern researchers working from the contactee and abductee literature have identified what they believe are the outlines of an ongoing genetic program that has extended across all of recorded human history and into the present. The core elements of this program, as understood from the research, involve the periodic introduction of genetic modifications into the human population through processes that the experiencers involved do not understand and do not consent to. Some researchers, notably Lloyd Pye in his work on what he called hominoid intervention, and others working in the field of directed panspermia and genetic archaeology, have argued that the human genome carries markers, not just chromosome 2 fusion, but specific sequences that appear in modern humans but not in other primate lineages, that are consistent with directed modification rather than purely natural evolution. These claims are not accepted by mainstream genetics, which has well-developed explanations for human genomic peculiarities within the framework of natural evolution. But mainstream genetics is also, inherently, a field that begins with the assumption that natural evolution is sufficient to explain the observed data, which means that evidence for non-natural intervention would need to be extraordinarily strong before the field would seriously entertain the hypothesis. The methodology of science is generally conservative in exactly this way, and conservatively so, which protects the enterprise from being driven by every extraordinary claim. But it also means that extraordinary claims that happen to be true will be resisted longer than they deserve to be. The hybridization program specifically, the apparent ongoing effort to produce beings that carry a combination of tall gray and human characteristics, is the most actively discussed and most emotionally charged component of the genetic program. For those who have experienced what they believe is their involvement in this program, the ethical dimensions are impossible to separate from the analytical ones. The feelings of violation, of being used without consent, of having something taken, children, genetic material, years of encounters that were never freely offered, are real and serious harms regardless of whatever larger purpose the program may serve. The fact that the beings conducting the program may, from their perspective, be operating within a framework that acknowledges the harm while judging the goal to outweigh it does not make the harm less real for those who have experienced it. And the discomfort of comparing this framework to human research ethics, which has evolved precisely through the experience of historical abuses to place the consent of the individual above the interests of the research, is appropriate and should not be glossed over. At the same time, some researchers who take both the abduction phenomenon and the ethical dimensions seriously have argued that there is a way of understanding the genetic program that is not purely exploitative. If the tall grays are, as the deepest layer of contact evidence suggests, beings in a genuine biological crisis beings whose ancient, over-specialized biology is failing in ways that threaten their long-term survival. And if humanity is not simply a resource to be extracted, but is, in some deep sense, related to them through a shared genetic history going back to the moments of our original creation, then the program is something more like a desperate family affair than a colonial extraction. It is still a relationship conducted without the informed consent of the less powerful party, but the motivation is different, and the ultimate goal, the survival and continuation of a lineage that humanity is part of, has implications for us as well as for them. The hybrid beings, the beings produced by this program, described in contact literature as occupying craft alongside both tall grays and short grays, described in some accounts as being introduced into human society in ways designed to make them capable of living as humans, represent, if they are real, something entirely new in the history of Earth. A category of being that is neither human nor tall gray, but something in between, something that carries the cognitive and psychic capacities of the grays alongside the emotional richness, the adaptability, and the social instincts of the human species. What this hybrid lineage might eventually become, and what role it might play in whatever future the tall grays are working toward, is one of the most fascinating and most unresolved questions in the entire field. Some researchers see the hybridization program as ultimately producing a replacement for humanity, a more controllable, more cosmic-minded species that the tall grays can work with more effectively than they can work with the unpredictable and emotionally volatile humans we currently are. Others see it as producing something more like a bridge. Beings who can exist in the space between the human and gray worlds, facilitating a relationship that pure communication across the enormous gap between our two forms of consciousness cannot easily manage. Whatever the ultimate purpose of the genetic program, its existence, if accepted, fundamentally changes the framework within which we understand the tall gray relationship with humanity. We are not simply an interesting planet they discovered and decided to study. We are, in some sense, their project, their investment, their, to use a word that carries its own weight of implication, their children. The ecology of intelligence, other species, and the tall gray position. The tall grays do not appear to operate in isolation. One of the most persistent and most surprising elements of the witness literature is the evidence for a much broader ecology of non-human intelligences, multiple species with different origins, different agendas, different relationships to humanity, and different relationships to each other, within which the tall grays occupy a specific position. Understanding that position, whether they are the dominant players, one of several competing powers, or subordinate to some even less visible hierarchy, is important for understanding what their presence on Earth actually means. The taxonomy of non-human species described across the body of contact literature is extensive and internally complex. Beyond the various categories of gray beings, researchers have cataloged consistent reports of what are generally called the reptilians. Tall, bipedal, scaled beings with a very different physical profile and a very different agenda from the grays, whose relationship with both humanity and the grays is described as adversarial to varying degrees. There are the beings consistently described as Nordics or Pleiadians, beings who appear essentially human in form, fair-skinned and often very tall, whose relationship with humanity is generally described as more actively benevolent, and whose agendas appear to include something that looks like advocacy for human autonomy and independence. There are beings described as insectoid or mantid, who appear in some of the deepest and most spiritually oriented contact accounts as overseers or hierarchical superiors, even to the tall grays. And there are others, beings of pure light or energy, beings whose physical form is variable and unclear, beings who appear to exist in a relationship to physical matter so different from our own that description becomes nearly impossible. The relationship between the tall grays and the reptilian beings is one of the most contested and least understood elements in this multi-species ecosystem. Some accounts describe an ancient rivalry or conflict, with the tall grays representing one side of a cosmic conflict in which Earth is either a prize or a battlefield. Others describe the tall grays as working in concert with reptilian beings on specific projects, including some of the activities on Earth that human witnesses find most disturbing. The truth may be that the relationship has changed over time, that what began as competition evolved into something more transactional, or that different factions within what we lump together as reptilians have different relationships with what we lump together as tall grays. The Nordic beings occupy a fascinating and important position in the multi-species picture. They are described as humanoid enough to move through human society without immediate detection, as emotionally relatable in ways the Greys are not, and as deeply invested in human freedom and self-determination in a way that puts them in direct tension with certain aspects of the Grey agenda. Multiple contact experiencers have described encounters with Nordic beings who seem to be actively counterweighing Grey influence, warning humans about the full extent of the Grey agenda, offering perspectives on the contact phenomenon that the Greys themselves do not provide, and sometimes apparently intervening in situations to protect human subjects. Whether the Nordics represent a genuinely benevolent ally of humanity, a competing power with its own agenda that is not ultimately benevolent but happens to oppose certain Grey activities, or something even more complex, is impossible to determine from the available evidence. The mantid beings, also called praying mantis beings for their insectoid physical resemblance to that Earth species, appear in a fascinating cluster of the deepest and most spiritually oriented contact accounts. They are very tall, very thin, with elongated triangular heads, large compound eyes, and a presence that experiencers consistently describe as ancient almost beyond imagination, radiating a kind of intelligence and wisdom that makes even the tall Greys seem relatively young by comparison. Some researchers have proposed that the mantid beings represent a level of the hierarchy above the tall Greys, that they are to the tall Greys what the tall Greys are to the short Greys, supervisors, decision makers, the beings who set the parameters within which the various programs operate. This interpretation would reposition the tall Greys not as the apex of the non-human intelligence present on Earth, but as middle managers in a vastly larger organizational structure whose ultimate command level is genuinely unknown. The implications of a multi-species reality for understanding the tall Grey agenda are significant. If the tall Greys are not the top of a hierarchy, but are themselves subordinate to other intelligences, or are competing with other intelligences for influence on Earth, then their activities on this planet take on a different character. They are not simply doing what they want with no accountability to any external authority. They are operating within constraints, pursuing goals that may be partially shaped by pressures from above and competition from the side. And the human beings caught up in their programs are not simply specimens or resources or genetic material. They are, in this larger picture, pawns on a board that is much larger than anyone in the human world has generally imagined. The question of whether there are any non-human intelligences that are consistently and unambiguously aligned with human interests, beings who want for humanity what humanity wants for itself, autonomy, development, freedom from exploitation, is one that the evidence doesn't clearly resolve. The Nordics come closest to fitting that description in the available literature, but even they appear to have agendas of their own, relationships to the larger situation that are more complex than pure altruism. The most honest answer may be that in a universe where intelligence has been developing for billions of years on potentially millions of worlds, a straightforwardly benevolent relationship between species at vastly different levels of development may be as rare as it is in our own world history, where interactions between civilizations at different levels of development have rarely ended entirely well for the less developed party. Messages from the contact. What the tall Greys communicate. Throughout the decades of documented contact between tall Grey beings and human subjects, whether in abduction contexts, in deliberate institutional contact, or in the kind of voluntary contact initiated by some individuals who have worked to establish communication, a body of communicated content has accumulated that, when viewed as a whole, reveals something about the being's understanding of the world and their understanding of humanity's place in it. This body of content, is not a single coherent document. It is a mosaic assembled from thousands of fragments, and its interpretation is contested. But certain themes appear with enough frequency and enough consistency across wildly different cultural and experiential contexts to deserve serious attention. The first and most consistently communicated theme is the antiquity of the universe and the commonality of life within it. The beings, when they communicate about the cosmos, convey not just information, but a sense, a felt understanding in the way their telepathic communications work, that the universe is not empty, that it teems with intelligence in forms and at levels that make human civilization look very young indeed, that the development of technological intelligence on a planet is not a rare accident, but a common outcome of the universe's basic structure, something that happens regularly, even inevitably, in the right conditions. This view of a universe full of intelligence is not simply comforting or inspiring. It comes with an implication that is somewhat more challenging. If intelligence is common, then the parochialism of thinking that humanity is the measure of intelligence, or that our current level of development represents any kind of achievement significant on a cosmic scale, is as limited as the medieval view that the Earth was the center of the cosmos. The second major theme is the nature of consciousness. Again and again, across different contact scenarios and different modes of communication, the tall grays convey something about the nature of awareness that challenges the materialist assumption that consciousness is simply a product of brain activity, an emergent property of sufficiently complex neural organization that begins when a particular arrangement of atoms achieves certain thresholds of computational complexity and ends when that organization dissolves. The alternative that is communicated in various framings is that consciousness is more fundamental than that awareness, in some form, precedes and underlies matter rather than being produced by it. That what we experience as individual consciousness is in some sense a window into a larger field of awareness that does not have the boundaries we think it has, and that what happens to awareness at the moment of biological death is not the end of experience, but a transition to a different mode of it. These communications are consistent with the core insights of meditative and mystical traditions across human history, and their delivery by non-human beings who appear to have operated at levels of existence that go far beyond anything in human experience gives them a particular weight, though the weight they carry is precisely impossible to assess from outside the experience. The third theme concerns Earth itself. The beings convey a relationship to the Earth that is not the relationship of a visitor to an alien world, but something that has more of the quality of kinship, as if they regard the biosphere of Earth with something analogous to what a very old family might feel about a beloved estate that younger generations are mismanaging. The concern they communicate about the trajectory of human civilization and its impact on the planetary ecosystem is not abstract or detached. It has urgency and it has a personal quality, as if what happens to Earth matters to them specifically, not just as a concern for the welfare of a random inhabited planet, but as a concern for something they have a stake in. This is consistent with the genetic ownership theory and with the idea that Earth's human population is, in some deep sense, their responsibility, both their creation and their investment. The fourth and most controversial theme is the future. The beings communicate about future events with a specificity and a confidence that is deeply unsettling to analyze, because it implies either a genuine capacity to know future states of reality or an extremely sophisticated capacity for prediction based on current trajectories. What is communicated is not a single fixed future, but something more like a fork in a road, a sense of branching possibilities, with certain outcomes more probable than others, depending on choices made in the present. The content of these future communications, as reported by contact experiencers, includes images of large-scale environmental catastrophe, images of social collapse and rebuilding, images of a contact event, a disclosed, public, acknowledged encounter between human civilization and non-human intelligence that reshapes the entire framework within which human society operates, and images of something beyond all of that which resists description in conventional language, but that experiencers return to with a quality of longing that suggests it is something profoundly good. What to make of this body of communication is genuinely difficult. If taken at face value, it represents the most important information that humanity has ever received, a cosmic perspective on our situation, delivered by beings who have been there long enough to see the curve of our trajectory, together with a set of warnings and possibilities that could, if acted on, make the difference between a future of catastrophic diminishment and one of extraordinary possibility. If taken with skepticism, it represents a sophisticated influence operation, carefully calibrated messaging designed to shape human consciousness and behavior in directions that serve the agenda of beings whose interests do not necessarily align with ours. The beings have the capacity for both, and the available evidence cannot definitively distinguish between them. What we can say is that the communications are real, that something is being transmitted, and that it is being received by thousands of individuals who, when they carry it back into ordinary consciousness, find it changes how they see the world in ways they did not ask for and cannot fully explain. The disclosure question: what happens when the world knows? We are living in the third decade of the 21st century in what feels to many researchers and insiders like the final stage of the longest sustained cover-up in modern history. The pace of official acknowledgement has accelerated in ways that, even 5 years ago, would have seemed remarkable. The United States government has officially confirmed the existence of programs studying UAPs. The Pentagon has released videos of encounters that it has declined to fully explain. Congress has held hearings. Whistleblowers have testified under oath. The word non-human has appeared in official congressional testimony in reference to recovered biological material, and that testimony has not been retracted. The drumbeat is growing louder, and the question that has defined this field for 7 decades, when will the truth be disclosed, has never felt more immediate. But what does disclosure actually look like when it comes? And what happens when the full scope of what has been withheld, the recovered craft, the biological material, the secret agreements, the underground infrastructure, the genetic program, is laid before a population that has been systematically misinformed about all of it for generations? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the most practically important questions in the entire field, because the management of the transition from secrecy to acknowledgement is, in many respects, as consequential as the original reality that was being kept secret. The case for disclosure is not difficult to make. The secrecy has been sustained at enormous cost, not just in the resources devoted to maintaining it, but in the opportunity cost of not having the full force of human scientific, philosophical, and social intelligence applied to the most significant phenomenon humanity has ever encountered. The decisions made in the late 1940s by a small group of men operating outside any democratic mandate have shaped the technological, cultural, and institutional landscape of the planet for 8 decades. And they did so without the consent or knowledge of the vast majority of human beings who have to live in the world those decisions created. Whatever the original justifications for secrecy, and there were real ones, rooted in the genuine geopolitical and social instabilities of the post-war period, the continuation of that secrecy into the 21st century cannot be justified on the same grounds. The case for caution and disclosure is also real, and it is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as institutional self-interest. The psychological impact on human civilization of confirmed non-human contact is genuinely unknown. The effect on religious traditions that place humanity at the center of creation, or that understand the cosmos as shaped specifically for human purposes, is unpredictable. The economic disruptions that would follow from the confirmation that non-human technology far beyond our own is in existence and potentially accessible could be severe. The geopolitical instabilities, the scramble among nation-states to control recovered technology, the conflicts that could erupt over that scramble, the collapse of existing power structures unable to integrate this reality are not trivial concerns. The historians who point out that the introduction of previously unknown realities into complex social systems has repeatedly produced catastrophic disruptions are not wrong as a matter of historical record. But the most important question is not whether disclosure will be disruptive. Of course it will be. The question is whether the disruption of knowing is worse than the disruption of not knowing, of continuing to navigate the most consequential relationship in human history in the dark, making decisions about science, about technology, about our relationship with the natural world, without access to the most important single piece of information about the context we are navigating in. There is an argument that disclosure, whatever its immediate costs, is the prerequisite for humanity being able to make rational decisions about its own future. That the tall grays, whatever their agenda, have an outsized influence on the trajectory of human civilization precisely because that influence operates in secrecy, and that bringing it into the light, even at the cost of short-term disruption, is the only way to begin developing the kind of informed, collectively deliberated response that a challenge of this magnitude deserves. The specific form that disclosure might take is something that insiders close to the process have been publicly discussing with increasing candor, the model that seems to be emerging from the pattern of graduated acknowledgement, from the way official statements have been carefully calibrated to be undeniable without being overwhelming, is one of slow, staged revelation. Not a single announcement, but a series of incremental admissions, each one normalizing the next, each one a little further down the road than the previous one. The strategy, if it is a strategy, appears designed to give the public time to absorb the implications of each stage before the next one is delivered. Whether this is wise management or simply a slower form of the same paternalism that characterized the original decision to withhold is a matter of genuine debate. What is certain is that the tall grays themselves, through whatever channels they influence human events, have an interest in how disclosure unfolds. The scenario in which the world learns of their presence through an adversarial process, a congressional investigation that reveals programs they would prefer remain hidden, a technological demonstration they did not authorize, a mass sighting they cannot suppress, is presumably less desirable from their perspective than a disclosure process that they have some hand in shaping. Whether the gradual normalization process we are currently observing is organic, driven by accumulating leaks and growing congressional pressure, or is itself partially orchestrated by interests operating from both sides of the human-gray relationship, is a question the available evidence cannot resolve. The mysteries that remain, what we still don't know. For all the evidence reviewed in this program, for all the witness testimony, the government documents, the ancient record, the patterns of biological activity, the contact communications, the whistleblower accounts, there are mysteries at the core of the tall gray phenomenon that remain genuinely unresolved. Not merely unresolved in the sense of awaiting official confirmation, but unresolved in the deeper sense that the available evidence doesn't clearly point to a single answer, and where the most intelligent researchers in the field disagree in ways that reflect genuine uncertainty rather than simple disagreement about known facts. The deepest mystery is the one we began with, and the one that will be the last to yield to investigation. What is the ultimate nature of these beings? Are they biological entities, evolved in the physical sense on a physical world, traveling in physical craft, conducting a physical program of genetic research? This is the nuts and bolts interpretation that most scientific researchers default to, because it is the one that maps most comfortably onto frameworks we already have for understanding the universe. But the evidence for it is also the evidence that creates the most problems. Physical craft that behave in ways that violate known physics, biological beings that appear in rooms without entering through physical doors, entities that communicate in ways that bypass the physical mechanisms of communication. A purely physical interpretation of what the tall grays are keeps running up against these anomalies. The alternative, that the tall grays are not purely physical entities, but beings who operate in multiple states of reality simultaneously, who are as at home in states of consciousness and energy as they are in physical space, who use physical craft and physical procedures when it suits their purpose, but who are not limited to the physical as we are, is harder to dismiss from the evidence than it might initially appear. The being's apparent ability to appear and disappear without physical movement, the nature of their communication, the reports of encounters that seem to happen in states of reality that are neither ordinary waking consciousness nor dream, but something different from both. All of this suggests beings whose relationship to the physical is more complex and more voluntary than our own. Whether this makes them interdimensional in the sense that term is typically used, or consciousness-based entities who choose physical manifestation for specific purposes, or something else entirely for which we don't yet have a vocabulary, is genuinely unknown. The mystery of their emotional life, or lack thereof, is one that haunts the contact literature in a particular way. Witnesses who interact with tall grays consistently note the absence of visible emotion. No facial expressions, no vocal tone, no body language of the kind that allows humans to read each other's emotional states. And yet many witnesses also report moments in which they sense emotion from the beings, not through the normal channels of emotional communication, but through the same direct mind-to-mind channel that the beings use for everything. And the emotions sensed in those moments are sometimes described as intense, ancient, and deeply personal. Sadness is one of the most commonly reported, a quality of longing. Occasionally, something that feels like love, not the warm, interpersonal love that human beings experience most readily, but something colder and larger, the love that might feel appropriate to beings who operate on geological timescales and who have seen civilizations rise and fall like tides. If the tall grays feel things, if behind the blank, efficient exterior there is a rich and ancient inner life shaped by billions of years of experience, then the ethical picture changes somewhat. Suffering has moral weight whether the sufferer looks like us or not. A civilization that is facing extinction, that has been traveling through the dark between the stars for so long that it has forgotten what it felt like to have a home, that is looking at humanity with a kind of desperate hope that we represent something they have lost. Such a civilization would be neither simply good nor simply evil. It would be complicated in the way that all beings in real difficulty are complicated. It would be capable of actions that, from outside and without context, look like exploitation, but that, from inside the full context of its situation, are the desperate measures of a species fighting for its survival. The mystery of their intentions, whether what they are doing to and with humanity is ultimately, in any meaningful sense, for our benefit as well as theirs, is the one that generates the most passionate disagreement among researchers and experiencers. The optimistic camp, represented by researchers like John Mack and Stephen Greer, sees the contact phenomenon as fundamentally transformative and ultimately positive, a cosmic push toward an expanded consciousness, a forced growth beyond the limitations that are currently threatening our survival as a species. The pessimistic camp, represented by researchers like David Jacobs, sees a program that is systematically preparing for a future in which human autonomy and human identity are significantly compromised by the success of the hybridization project. A future in which humans are, in some sense, less human than they are today, shaped in directions they did not choose by beings whose priorities are not our own. Between these poles, and probably closer to the truth than either, is a picture in which neither hope nor fear is adequate, in which the complexity of a relationship spanning tens of thousands of years and involving beings at vastly different levels of development and consciousness has produced an entanglement too intricate to be resolved by simple moral categorization. The tall grays are not our saviors, they are not our destroyers, they may be something much more unsettling, the architects of our past and the interested parties in our future, beings who have shaped us in ways we are only beginning to understand, who need from us things we are only beginning to become aware of, and who are operating on a timeline so vast that what looks to us like exploitation or betrayal may, from their perspective, be the careful management of an investment they have been tending for longer than our civilization has existed. The philosophical horizon, what it means. There is a question that sits beneath all the specific questions we have been examining, a question that any honest engagement with the tall gray phenomenon eventually arrives at, and that may be the most important question of all. Not what are they, not what do they want, not what have they done, but what does it mean? What does it mean for us as a species to live in a universe where what the evidence suggests is real? What does it mean for our understanding of ourselves, our history, our potential, and our place in a cosmos that is so much more populated, so much older, and so much stranger than anything our civilization has previously been asked to accommodate? The meaning question is the one that the scientific and investigative framework of UFO research is least equipped to address, because it is not a question that evidence, however rigorously collected, can answer. It is a philosophical question, a spiritual question, a question about significance and value and purpose in a universe that turns out to be structured very differently from what we assumed. And it is a question that each person who encounters the evidence seriously must ultimately answer for themselves. What the evidence can tell us is this: we are not alone. We have never been alone. The universe did not produce intelligence once on this small planet and leave the rest of cosmic history empty. It has been generating intelligence for billions of years, and that intelligence, in forms whose variety we can barely imagine from our limited vantage point, has been developing, traveling, interacting, and evolving for far longer than our own civilization has been drawing on cave walls. Whatever we are not the measure of what intelligence can be. We are one instance of something that happens across the cosmos, and our instance is young and tender and consequential in ways that we have not yet been allowed to fully understand. The encounter with the tall grays is, at the deepest level, an encounter with our own context, with the larger frame within which the story of humanity is embedded. And that encounter, however it has been conducted, with whatever mixture of manipulation and genuine communication, with whatever balance of exploitation and kinship, has the potential to be the most significant awakening our species has undergone since the development of language itself. The question is not whether the awakening is coming. The evidence suggests it is. The question is whether we will meet it with the wisdom and the courage it requires, whether we can hold together the fear and the wonder, the violation and the potential, the terrible implications of what we have been told without our consent, and the extraordinary possibility of what we might become when we are finally allowed to engage with the full truth of our situation as adult members of a cosmos that has been waiting with whatever passes for patience in beings whose lifetime spans what we call history for us to grow up. The tall grays are not waiting for us to become like them. The evidence suggests they have, in some sense, already seen to it that we cannot. What they may be waiting for is something they cannot engineer directly, something that must come from within us, that has to be grown rather than manufactured, that represents not the traits they have borrowed from our biology, but the ones they most need and least possess, the ones they have apparently been coming back for across 10,000 years of history, across the dreams and the abductions and the ancient initiations and the modern contact, our fire, our chaos, our capacity to love and to rage and to hope and to despair and to begin again, our astonishing, terrible, beautiful human noise. What the evidence demands toward a new framework. As we move into what feels like the final phase before some form of official acknowledgement of the non-human presence, the question of how humanity will frame and understand what it is learning becomes critically important. The frameworks we use to understand the tall grays will shape the responses we develop, the policies we adopt, and the quality of the engagement we are ultimately able to have with whatever relationship is being offered or imposed. A framework built primarily around fear will produce one set of responses. A framework built around naive trust will produce another. What the evidence actually supports is something more complex than either. The framework that the evidence demands is one that takes seriously both the power asymmetry and the genuine entanglement. The tall grays are vastly more powerful than us technologically, have operated on this planet for far longer than our civilization has existed, and have conducted programs involving human beings without their knowledge or consent that would constitute serious ethical violations by any standard we would apply to interactions within our own species. These facts cannot be softened or reframed away, and any framework that tries to is not being honest with the evidence. At the same time, the framework must account for the genuine complexity of what appears to be an ancient relationship with multiple dimensions: genetic, cognitive, historical, and possibly spiritual, that is not cleanly separable into perpetrators and victims, colonizers and colonized. The most useful analogy, however imperfect, may be the framework that indigenous peoples around the world have developed for understanding their relationship with far more powerful colonizing civilizations, a framework that refuses to accept the terms of the relationship as just or fair, that insists on the rights and the dignity and the value of the less powerful party, and that simultaneously recognizes the reality of the power imbalance and works with it rather than pretending it doesn't exist. This is not a comfortable framework. It does not allow for either the comfort of victimhood or the comfort of optimism. But it is one that has, in practice, allowed peoples who are genuinely in relationships of highly asymmetric power to maintain their identity, advocate for their interests, and ultimately develop forms of engagement that serve their own values rather than simply accepting the terms offered by the more powerful party. Applied to humanity's relationship with the tall grays, such a framework would begin with the insistence on transparency, the demand, on behalf of the billions of human beings who have been excluded from any knowledge of or voice in this relationship, for full disclosure of what has occurred, what has been agreed to on their behalf without their knowledge, and what the terms and consequences of the ongoing programs are. It would insist on the right of humanity to participate in decisions about its own future, including the future of its genetic heritage, rather than having those decisions made by beings who, however ancient and intelligent, do not carry the consciousness of the people whose lives are affected, and it would maintain the possibility of genuine relationship, of an engagement between our two civilizations that is based on something approaching honest accounting of interests and mutual respect for the distinctive value of each party, without requiring the naive assumption that such a relationship will be easy or that it will immediately work out on terms that are entirely favorable to us. The emerging disclosure process, whatever its shape and timeline, will be the most important political and philosophical challenge human civilization has ever faced. It will require wisdom we are not sure we have, courage we have never been asked to demonstrate at this scale, and a quality of collective action that our species, for all its remarkable achievements, has not yet managed to sustain. Whether we are adequate to that challenge is genuinely unknown. But the tall grays, by the evidence, have been asking that question about us for a very long time. The answer is not yet in. Encounters of the deepest kind, consciousness and contact. The deepest accounts of human tall gray contact are not found in the abduction literature, not in government documents, and not in the testimony of military insiders. They are found in a category of experience that is harder to categorize and harder to study, that bridges the territory between what we call UFO encounters and what we call mystical or spiritual experience. These are the accounts of people who describe contact with the tall grays not as something done to them against their will, but as a meeting, a genuine encounter between two forms of consciousness in a space that seems to be neither physical nor psychological, but something of a different order. Dr. John Mack was not a person predisposed to take mystical claims at face value. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a trained clinician whose professional identity was built around rigorous analysis and evidence-based interpretation. His engagement with abduction experiencers, which eventually generated an institutional review by Harvard, so threatening was it to academic respectability, came about because he couldn't make the psychology work. The people who came to him with these experiences were not psychologically disturbed as a group in any measurable way. They were not particularly prone to fantasy or suggestion. They did not share a prior cultural framework that would explain the specificity and consistency of what they reported. And what they reported, when he listened to it without his professional training insisting on the need to pathologize it, was something that demanded a different kind of engagement than clinical psychology could provide. What Mack found when he sat with these experiences and took them seriously as possible encounters with something genuinely real and genuinely other was that they were transformative in a specific direction, toward an expanded sense of the nature of reality, toward a felt understanding of the interconnection of all things, toward a diminishment of the fear of death, and an increase in the sense of participation in something vast and meaningful. These are not the outcomes you would expect from trauma, from psychosis, or from elaborated fantasy. They are the outcomes associated with genuine transformative experience. The kind of experience that mystics across all traditions have described, that near-death experiencers consistently report, that certain forms of meditation and contemplative practice can eventually produce. This consistency led Mack to a conclusion that cost him professionally, but that he defended to his death. That the abduction phenomenon, whatever else it was functionally and experientially equivalent to mystical initiation. That the beings involved, whatever their ultimate nature, were serving a function in human consciousness that was, in the largest sense, developmental. This does not resolve the ethical questions about consent and agency. A tradition of initiatory experience that includes trauma and involuntary transformation is not automatically good simply because it transforms, but it does complicate the simple picture of exploitation and victimization that might otherwise dominate the assessment of the abduction phenomenon. And it raises the possibility that what looks, from one level of analysis, like a biological extraction program, is simultaneously, from another level, something more like what the ancient traditions of many cultures describe: the painful, transformative, non-consensual initiation of a young consciousness by a much older and wiser one that understands what is needed even when the initiate cannot yet see it. The mystical dimension of the contact experience points toward the most fundamental question in this entire territory: the question of what consciousness is and what the universe ultimately is, and whether the two questions might have the same answer. If the tall grays are not purely physical beings, but beings who exist at a level of reality where consciousness is primary rather than derivative, where awareness is the ground of what is, and physical matter is a particular configuration that awareness takes on for specific purposes, then the entire framework of material science within which we have been trying to understand them is insufficient. Not wrong exactly. The physical dimension of their activities is real, their craft are real, the biological procedures are real, but insufficient. Like trying to understand music by analyzing only the physics of sound waves, accurate as far as it goes, but missing what the music is. The most consistent message from the deepest level of contact with tall gray beings across every cultural context and every mode of encounter is exactly this: that what humanity takes to be the whole of reality is a fraction of what is. That the physical world, the world of matter and energy, of space and time, of cause and effect, is real but bounded, and the bounds are not where we think they are. That awareness extends beyond the body, beyond the individual, beyond the species. That the universe is not the blind, purposeless machinery that a certain tradition in modern science has described it as, but something more like a vast, ancient project of becoming, something that has intention, that has direction, that has, in the deepest sense of the word, meaning. Whether the tall grays are themselves fully at home in that larger reality, whether their enormous cranial capacity and their apparent psychic abilities represent a genuine attainment of the expanded consciousness they point toward for humanity, or whether they are travelers in that territory who have mapped it without yet fully inhabiting it, is a question that the evidence cannot answer. The accounts of those who have engaged with them most deeply suggest that they are in some ways as limited by their own perspective as we are by ours. That the universe they are describing is not entirely transparent to them any more than it is to us, and that whatever they are working toward in their relationship with humanity may be at the highest level something they are reaching toward as much as they are guiding us toward. That the relationship, in its fullest expression, may be not master and student, not creator and creation, not exploiter and resource, but something more equal than any of those framings. Two very different forms of consciousness, each carrying something the other needs, feeling their way toward an integration that neither could achieve alone. Conclusion: the longest story. We began this hour with the image of a light on the horizon, an image so ancient that it shows up in the earliest art our species made, and so contemporary that people all over the world are looking at their phones this week, reading accounts of encounters their governments no longer entirely deny. We have traveled from cave walls in the Sahara to classified programs in the Nevada desert. We have listened to soldiers and scientists and farmers and professors and medics who agreed on the essentials of something that their institutions have spent decades insisting is impossible. We have tried to look honestly at the most complex, the most contested, and arguably the most important question in the human story. What do we know at the end of all this? We know that something is here, something non-human, ancient, technologically incomprehensible, and deeply entangled with our history and our biology. We know that governments have known about it for longer than any of us have been alive, and have made decisions about how to manage that knowledge that were never submitted to any democratic process. We know that hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of human beings have had direct physical and psychological encounters with beings that fit the profile of the tall grays, and that those encounters have been real enough to change the lives, the worldviews, and the fundamental reality maps of the people who experienced them. We know that the genetic program, whatever its precise mechanisms, is ongoing. We know that the technology gap between what we can build and what is flying through our airspace is real and staggering. We know that the ancient record, read without the assumption that it must be mythological, contains accounts of contact with beings who match the tall gray profile, with a consistency that speaks to a history so much longer than our documented one that it humbles any neat narrative about human uniqueness. And we know, or we can see clearly enough to take it seriously, that the situation is changing, that the centuries of official silence are being replaced, slowly and imperfectly, by a process of partial acknowledgement that has its own agenda and its own limitations, but that represents a genuine shift in the institutional management of this reality, that the tall grays, whatever their agenda, are operating in a world that is becoming less able to pretend they are not there, and that humanity, fragile, brilliant, chaotic, magnificent humanity, is being asked, by the sheer accumulative pressure of evidence and acknowledgement, to begin the process of figuring out what to do about it. The story of the tall grays is not over. It is not even, by most indications, close to its most important chapters. What we have been doing in this program is reading the early pages of a book whose conclusion we cannot see, trying to understand the characters whose motivations are only partially disclosed, trying to make sense of a plot that is still very much in motion. The effort is worthwhile because the alternative, to remain ignorant of the most consequential relationship our species is in, is not wisdom but willful blindness. And willful blindness in relationships of power has never served the less powerful party. What comes next will be shaped by many forces, by the political calculations of governments deciding how much to reveal and when, by the activities of the beings themselves, whose agenda continues to unfold on its own timeline, by the courage and the curiosity of researchers who refuse to accept the boundaries of the acceptable, and by the ordinary men and women who wake in the night to find that the world is larger and stranger and more intimately connected to something beyond themselves than they had imagined. Their experiences, their testimonies, their transformed lives, these are the most important data points in the entire field, not because they are beyond question, but because they are the human face of something that is happening to the human race, something that has been happening for a very long time, something that, whoever else is involved and whatever else it means, is also our story. The light on the horizon has not gone away. It has been getting closer for 10,000 years. The question is not whether it will arrive. The question is whether we will be ready. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.